Chapter 1. The Black Brothers' Arrival. The iron bars of the Red Keep's dungeons had been Ned Stark's world for what felt like an eternity, but in truth had been only days. Now, as he stood in the Sept of Baelor, before the assembled crowd, stripped of his fine clothes and dressed in the rough brown wool of a penitent, he felt the weight of every lie he was about to speak. "I am Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King." His voice carried across the silent crowd, each word like swallowing broken glass. "I come before you to confess my treason in the sight of gods and men." The words tasted of ash and dishonor, but behind him stood his daughter Sansa, her face pale with fear and confusion. For her, he would speak any falsehood, bear any shame. "I betrayed the faith of my king and the trust of my friend, Robert. I swore to defend and protect his children, but before his blood was cold, I plotted to murder his son and seize the throne for myself." Each lie drove deeper into his soul like Valyrian steel, but he pressed on. "Let the High Septon and Baelor the Blessed bear witness to what I say. Joffrey Baratheon is the one true heir to the Iron Throne, by the grace of all the gods, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the realm." The crowd's murmur was like distant thunder, but all Ned could hear was the hammering of his own heart. He had expected death, had prepared for it, made peace with joining his ancestors in whatever lay beyond. But then young King Joffrey had spoken, his voice high and cruel. "My mother wishes you to join the Night's Watch. Stripped of all titles and land, you would serve the realm in permanent exile at the Wall." Cersei Lannister's intervention had saved his life, but as Ned was led away in chains, he wondered if death might not have been the kinder fate. The journey north began 2 days later. Yoren, the gruff Night's Watch recruiter, had collected his usual assortment of thieves, rapists, and murderers from the capital's dungeons. Among them now walked the former Lord of Winterfell, his hands bound like any common criminal. The irony was not lost on the other prisoners, who alternated between suspicious glances and crude jests about the highborn lord, who would soon share their black brother's fate. "Never thought I'd see a Stark in chains," muttered one gap-toothed criminal as they made camp on the third night. "Always heard you northern lords were different from the rest." Ned said nothing. He had learned that silence was his best defense against both mockery and pity. The weight of his false confession hung around his neck, heavier than any chains. Every mile that took him further from King's Landing was another mile from Sansa, another step into an exile that felt very much like a living death. Yoren, for his part, treated Ned with a grudging respect that the other prisoners lacked. The old recruiter had known Brandon Stark, Ned's elder brother, and had served the Night's Watch for more years than most men had lived. "The Wall's got a way of making all men equal," he told Ned quietly one evening as they sat apart from the others. "Don't matter what you were before you took the Black. Only matters what you do after." But as their ragged caravan continued northward, past the Neck and into the familiar landscape of the north, Ned felt anything but equal. He was a broken man, a father who had abandoned his duty to his children, a lord who had chosen life and lies over death and honor. The ancient words of House Stark echoed mockingly in his mind. Winter is coming. It had come for him in the worst possible way. The King's Road gave way to smaller paths as they approached the Gift, that stretch of land granted to the Night's Watch by ancient kings. The further north they travelled, the more the familiar sights of his homeland seemed to accuse him. Every copse of Godswood, every stream that might flow toward Winterfell, reminded him of what he had lost through his own choices. On the 10th day of their journey, the Wall appeared on the horizon. Ned had seen it before, of course, but only briefly, and in his youth, when honor seemed a simpler thing. Now, as the massive barrier of ice and stone grew larger with each step, it seemed less like a wonder of the world and more like the bars of the largest prison ever built. 700 feet tall and stretching from horizon to horizon, the wall dominated the landscape with an authority that made even former lords feel small. Castle Black squatted at the wall's base like a collection of dark tumors against the pristine ice. It was smaller than Ned remembered, shabbier, with gaps in the walls and buildings that looked like they might collapse in the next strong wind. This was where he would spend whatever years remained to him, among criminals and outcasts, defending a realm that had cast him aside. The gates of Castle Black opened to admit their party, and Ned found himself in a courtyard that bustled with activity despite its apparent decay. Men in black wool moved with purpose, tending to duties that kept this ancient fortress functioning. Some were young, some old. Some bore the soft look of former nobles, while others had the hard edges of men raised in violence. All wore the same black wool, the great equalizer of the Night's Watch. "Yoren!" A booming voice cut through the courtyard noise. "What fresh meat have you brought us this time?" The speaker was a large man with a greying beard and a face weathered by years of northern winters. His black wool was better maintained than most, and he carried himself with the authority of command. This could only be Lord Commander Drior Mormont, the old bear himself. "The usual lot, Lord Commander," Yoren replied, gesturing to his charges, "though this batch includes someone you'll want to meet proper-like." Mormont's eyes swept over the new arrivals and stopped when they reached Ned. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by something that might have been surprise or respect. "Eddard Stark," he said quietly. "I'd heard rumors, but I scarce believed them. The honor of Winterfell, come to take the Black." "Just another recruit now, Lord Commander," Ned replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Eddard Stark died in King's Landing. I'm just a man who seeks to serve." Mormont studied him for a long moment. "We'll see about that. The Night's Watch has a way of revealing a man's true nature, stripped of all the trappings he wore before." He gestured to a nearby steward. "See the new men settled. They'll take their vows when they're ready." As the steward led them deeper into the castle, Ned caught sight of a familiar figure crossing the courtyard. Tall and lean, with the Stark look written plain on his face, Jon Snow moved with the confidence of a young man who had found his place in the world. Ned's heart lurched with a mixture of joy and dread. His bastard son, the boy he had raised as his own, the keeper of his deepest secret, was here, and would now see his father reduced to the same level as any common criminal. Jon stopped dead when he saw Ned, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been grief. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other across the courtyard of Castle Black, the gulf between their former relationship and their new circumstances as wide as the wall was tall. "Father," Jon's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried all the questions he couldn't ask in a public courtyard. "Jon," Ned nodded formally, as one Night's Watch brother might acknowledge another. "I am glad to see you well." The awkwardness of the moment was broken by the steward's impatient clearing of his throat. "Come along, recruits. Daylight's burning, and there's much to explain about your new life here." As Ned followed the steward toward what would be his new quarters, he caught one last glimpse of Jon standing frozen in the courtyard, his face a mask of complicated emotions. The boy, no, the man, for Jon was a man grown now, would need time to process what his father's presence meant for both of them. The dormitory where new recruits were housed was a far cry from the Lord Solar at Winterfell. Rough wooden bunks lined the walls, each with a straw mattress and a single woolen blanket. A central fire pit provided warmth, though the room was still cold enough that Ned could see his breath. The smell of unwashed bodies, old smoke, and something indefinably institutional filled the air. "Home, sweet home," muttered one of his fellow recruits, a thin man who had introduced himself as Darian and claimed to be a former bard. From the Red Keep's dungeons to this, quite the improvement. Ned chose a bunk near the back wall and sat heavily upon it. The straw mattress was lumpy and thin, but after days of sleeping on the hard ground during their journey north, it felt almost luxurious. He pulled off his boots, worn things that had once been fine leather but now bore the stains of the road, and rubbed his feet. Around him, the other new recruits settled in with varying degrees of complaint and resignation. They were a mixed lot, criminals seeking to escape the king's justice, bastards looking for a place in the world, second sons with no inheritance, and now one former lord whose honour had led him to disgrace. As night fell over Castle Black, Ned lay on his narrow bunk and stared at the rough wooden ceiling. Somewhere in this ancient fortress, his son Jon was likely struggling with the same sleepless thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new humiliations, new tests of his resolve. But tonight, for the first time since his arrest in King's Landing, Ned Stark allowed himself to weep. For his daughters, for his wife, for the honour he had traded away, and for the man he had been before the Game of Thrones had claimed everything he held dear. The wall loomed outside, eternal and implacable, and tomorrow he would begin to learn what it truly meant to be a brother of the Night's Watch. Winter was coming, indeed, but it had already arrived for Eddard Stark. Chapter 2. Oaths and Revelations. The morning of Ned's vow ceremony dawned grey and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that seemed to cut through wool and leather as if they were silk. He stood in the courtyard of Castle Black, alongside 6 other recruits, each man lost in his own thoughts about the oath they were about to swear. For most, it was a simple transaction, their crimes in exchange for a life of service. For Ned Stark, it was the final severing of ties to everything he had ever been. Jon Snow stood among the assembled Night's Watch brothers, his face carefully neutral, but Ned could see the tension in his son's posture. They had barely spoken since Ned's arrival 3 days prior, a few awkward exchanges about meals and duties, nothing more. The weight of their changed relationship hung between them like morning mist, visible but intangible. "It's time," announced Maester Aemon, his milky eyes somehow still penetrating, despite their blindness. The ancient Maester moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned to navigate the world without sight, guided by a steward, but clearly in command of the ceremony. The procession wound through the tunnel that led beneath the wall, emerging into the haunted forest beyond. Here, in a clearing dominated by an ancient weirwood tree, the Night's Watch had sworn their oaths for thousands of years. The heart tree's white bark seemed to glow in the dim light, its carved face stern and watchful, red sap weeping from its eyes like tears of blood. Ned had stood before heart trees all his life, had prayed to the old gods in the godswood of Winterfell since he was old enough to walk. But this felt different, more final, more binding than any oath he had sworn before. When he had married Catelyn, when he had accepted Robert's call to be Hand of the King, those had been choices made freely. This was the last choice of a man who had run out of options. "Do you understand what you're doing?" Jon asked quietly, appearing at Ned's side as they approached the weirwood. His voice carried a mixture of concern and something that might have been anger. "I understand perfectly," Ned replied, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I am trading one service for another. Instead of serving kings who lie, I will serve the realm itself." "You were the hand of the king." Jon's voice was barely above a whisper, but the accusation in it was clear. "Lord of Winterfell, you had honor, respect. How could you throw it all away for this?" Ned stopped walking and turned to face his son. No, his brother now, for they would both be brothers in black. "Honor?" The word came out more bitter than he intended. What honor is there in a lie, Jon? What respect comes from a false confession? He saw Jon flinch and softened his voice. Sometimes a man must choose between his personal honor and a greater duty. I chose to protect those who could not protect themselves. Jon's jaw tightened. Sansa, among others. Ned's hand briefly touched Jon's shoulder, a gesture he immediately regretted for its familiarity. "You understand duty, Jon. You came here for your own reasons, made your own hard choice. Can you not understand mine?" Before Jon could respond, Maester Aemon's voice called them to attention. "Brothers of the Night's Watch, we gather before the old gods to witness these men take their sacred oaths. Let those who would speak the words come forward." The 7 recruits stepped into the circle formed by the assembled brothers. Ned found himself standing between Darian, the former bard who never stopped complaining, and a sullen young man named Gren, whom Jon had befriended. The ancient words felt heavy on his tongue as he spoke them with the others. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns, and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come." As the final words left his lips, Ned felt something shift inside him. Not the magical transformation he might have expected in a song or story, but a quieter change, a sense of purpose, different from what he had known before, but no less real. He was no longer Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell. He was simply a brother of the Night's Watch, sworn to defend the wall until his dying day. The ceremony concluded with each new brother receiving his assignment. Most were destined for the builders or the stewards, but when Maester Aemon announced Ned's placement, a murmur ran through the assembled men. "Eddard of House?" "No." The old Maester caught himself. "Brother Eddard will serve as a ranger, under the direct command of First Ranger Benjen Stark." Ned's heart lurched at the mention of his brother's name. Benjen had been First Ranger for years, but the siblings had rarely corresponded. Now they would serve together, though Benjen was somewhere beyond the wall on a ranging mission, and had been for weeks. The irony was not lost on Ned, that his disgrace might finally bring him closer to the brother he had barely known. The walk back to Castle Black was subdued, each new brother processing what they had committed themselves to. As they passed through the tunnel beneath the wall, Ned ran his fingers along the ancient ice, marveling at its solidity and permanence. This barrier had stood for thousands of years, built by Brandon the Builder with the help of giants and magic. Now it was his to defend, his purpose and his prison both. That evening, Lord Commander Jorah Mormont summoned Ned to his solar. The room was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with maps covering one wall and a fire crackling in the hearth. Mormont gestured for Ned to sit while he poured 2 cups of mulled wine. "So," the old bear said, without preamble, "you've taken the Black. How do you find it so far?" "Different from what I expected, Lord Commander." Ned accepted the wine gratefully. "More Peaceful, perhaps. Mormont snorted. Peace? You haven't been beyond the wall yet, brother. There's precious little peace to be found out there. He settled into his chair, studying Ned over his cup. Tell me, what do you know of our current situation? The state of the Night's Watch, our resources, our challenges? Very little, I'm afraid. Only what any southern lord might know, that you guard the wall against wildlings and worse things. Worse things, yes. Mormont's expression darkened. 3 of my rangers have gone missing in the past month. Experienced men, not green boys who might lose their way. And the reports we're getting from those who do return. He trailed off, shaking his head. Dead things that walk, they say. Creatures of ice and shadow. Old Nan's tales made real. Ned leaned forward, his strategic mind engaging despite his exhaustion. You believe these reports? I believe something is stirring beyond the wall, something we haven't seen for generations. The wildlings are fleeing south in greater numbers than ever before, and they're not running from other wildlings. Mormont stood and moved to the wall of maps, pointing to various locations marked with red pins. Disappearances here, here, and here. Strange lights in the sky, reported by rangers. And now winter is coming. Not just the season, but something else. Something older and more dangerous. What would you have me do? Ned asked. I'm just one man, and newly sworn at that. You're Eddard Stark, Mormont replied bluntly. Or you were. You commanded armies, governed a kingdom, served as hand to King Robert. Those skills don't disappear just because you've put on a black cloak. He turned from the maps to face Ned directly. The Night's Watch is dying, brother. We have fewer than 1,000 men to guard 300 miles of wall. Half our castles stand empty, and those that remain are undermanned and undersupplied. We need leaders, men who understand strategy and logistics. Ned considered this. And what of the South? Surely King Joffrey. He stumbled over the name, still bitter about acknowledging the boy's legitimacy. Surely the Iron Throne provides support. Mormont's laugh was harsh. The Iron Throne has its own troubles brewing. Word reached us yesterday that your son Robb is raising banners in the north. War is coming to the 7 kingdoms, brother, and when lords are fighting each other, they have little time or gold to spare for the wall. The news hit Ned like a physical blow. Robb, his boy, gathering the northern houses for war. It would be for him, of course, to avenge his father's supposed treason, to rescue his sisters. Ned closed his eyes, seeing in his mind the faces of men who would die because of choices he had made. There's more, Mormont continued, his voice gentler now. Your bastard son has shown promise since he arrived. Real promise. He's natural leader, brave, intelligent, but he struggles with anger, resentment. Your presence here seems to have unsettled him. Jon is a good man, Ned said carefully. He always struggled with his place in the world. Bastards often do, but he's found his place here, or was beginning to. Now, Mormont shrugged. Perhaps you can help him find his way again. The Night's Watch needs men like Jon Snow, but only if he can move past his bitterness. After leaving the Lord Commander's solar, Ned walked the battlements of Castle Black, looking out over the haunted forest that stretched endlessly northward. Somewhere out there, his brother Benjen was ranging with his men, searching for threats both natural and supernatural. Somewhere to the south, his son Robb was preparing for war. And here, caught between the ancient ice and the burning world of men, Ned tried to find meaning in his exile. He was not alone on the wall. As he rounded a corner, he found Maester Aemon standing at the edge of the battlements, his blind eyes turned toward the stars. Brother Eddard, the old man said without turning. Trouble sleeping? You could say that, Meister. Too many thoughts, all of them heavy. Aemon nodded slowly. I know the feeling well. I have had many sleepless nights in my years here, wrestling with choices made and unmade. He gestured for Ned to join him at the wall's edge. Tell me, what weighs on you most heavily? Ned was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to reveal to this ancient man who had served the Night's Watch longer than anyone. I think of my children, he said finally. The ones I left behind, the choices they will face without guidance. I wonder if I failed them by choosing to live. Ah, Aemon said softly. The burden of fatherhood does not end with the taking of our vows. I never had children of my own, but I have watched many fathers struggle with that guilt. He turned slightly toward Ned, his unseeing eyes somehow piercing. There is one here who might benefit from a father's wisdom, if you could find the courage to offer it. Jon. The name came out as barely a whisper. He carries his own burdens, that one. Questions of identity, of purpose, of belonging. In some ways he is as lost as you are, though he hides it better. Aemon's voice grew thoughtful. There are irregularities in his bloodline that trouble him, though he speaks of them to no one. Ned's heart stopped. Did Aemon know? The old man had been at the wall for decades, had served through the reigns of multiple kings. If anyone might have pieced together the truth about Jon's parentage. What irregularities? Ned asked carefully. Aemon was silent for so long that Ned wondered if he had heard the question. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and precise. I have lived through the fall of kings and the rise of usurpers. I have seen the price of secrets, Brother Eddard, and I have learned that truth, however painful, is often kinder than the lies we tell to protect those we love. The words hung in the cold air between them, heavy with implication. Ned gripped the stone wall until his knuckles went white, staring out into the darkness beyond the wall. Here, in this place of exile and brotherhood, perhaps it was finally time for truth. But not yet. Some secrets were too dangerous, even here at the end of the world. I should sleep, Ned said finally. Tomorrow brings new duties, new challenges. Indeed it does, Aemon agreed. But remember, Brother Eddard, the Watch is more than just a punishment or exile. For many of us, it has been a chance at redemption, a way to serve something larger than ourselves. As Ned made his way back to the dormitory, Aemon's words echoed in his mind. Redemption. Perhaps that was what he sought here. Not just escape from his failures, but a chance to atone for them. The Night's Watch protected the realm from threats both seen and unseen. If he could serve that mission faithfully, perhaps he could find a measure of peace with the choices that had brought him here. In his narrow bunk, surrounded by the snores and shifting of his fellow brothers, Ned Stark closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would bring his first ranging beyond the wall, his first real test as a brother of the Night's Watch. Tonight he allowed himself to hope that in this place of ancient oaths and honorable service, he might yet find a way to protect his family and serve the greater good, even if they never knew the price he had paid to do so. Chapter 3. The King in the North. The Raven arrived on a grey morning, its black wings cutting through the perpetual mist that shrouded Castle Black. Ned watched from the courtyard as the bird landed on the rookery tower, carrying news from the south that would change everything. He had been a brother of the Night's Watch for barely a week, but already he could feel the pull of his former life tugging at him like an undertow. Maester Aemon summoned him to the rookery an hour later, his blind eyes somehow conveying both sympathy and concern as he handed over the sealed parchment. The Stark direwolf was pressed into the wax, Robb's seal, not Catelyn's flowing script that Ned had expected. "My Lord Father," the letter began, and Ned's heart clenched at the formal address. "The North remembers, and the North has not forgotten the injustices done to House Stark. Though you have chosen the path of exile over the path of honor, your blood still runs in northern veins." The words cut deeper than any blade. Ned read on, his hands trembling slightly as Robb's carefully measured prose revealed the depth of his son's confusion and anger. "Karstark and Umber have called their banners. The Mormonts send word from Bear Island that they stand ready. Even the mountain clans speak of justice for Winterfell. They look to me now, Father, as they once looked to you. But how can I lead them when I do not understand why you chose dishonor over death? How can I rally them to avenge a man who would not fight for his own name?" Ned set the letter down, his vision blurring. He had known this moment would come, had dreaded it since the moment he spoke those false words of confession in the Sept of Baelor. His choice to live, to take the black, had consequences that rippled far beyond his own fate. The letter continued. "Mother weeps for you still, but her tears are bitter ones. She says you have abandoned us twice, first by going south, then by choosing exile when honor demanded you die with truth on your lips. I do not know what to believe, Father. I know only that the realm bleeds, and the wolves must decide whether to howl together or hunt alone." There was more. Reports of Jaime Lannister's movements, word that King Joffrey grew more erratic by the day, rumors that Stannis Baratheon was gathering ships on Dragonstone. But it was the personal anguish in his son's words that struck Ned most deeply. Robb was 18 years old, thrust into a position of leadership he had never asked for, forced to make decisions that would affect thousands of lives. "Difficult news?" Jon's voice came from behind him. Ned turned to find his bastard son standing in the doorway of the rookery, concern etched on his features. "Your brother faces hard choices," Ned replied, handing Jon the letter. "The North is restless, and he must decide whether to lead them to war." Jon read in silence, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Ned with something that might have been accusation. "They don't understand," he said quietly. "They think you ran from your fate." "Perhaps I did." Ned moved to the window, looking out over the wall that stretched endlessly east and west. Perhaps choosing to live was the coward's path, after all. "You chose to protect Sansa," Jon said firmly. "You chose your daughter's life over your own pride. That's not cowardice. That's what fathers do." The simple declaration hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to address. Jon had called him a father, not a brother, despite their new equal status in the Night's Watch. It was a reminder of bonds that transcended oaths and circumstances. "Your brother needs guidance," Ned said, after a long moment. "He's young, and the lords who surround him see an opportunity to settle old grievances with the crown. They'll push him toward war whether it serves the North or not." "Then guide him," Jon replied. "You're not dead, Father. Your voice can still reach him." That evening, Ned sat in his cell-like chamber, struggling to find words that could bridge the gulf between Castle Black and Winterfell. How could he explain choices that he barely understood himself? How could he counsel a son to make war or peace when his own decisions had led to disgrace and exile? The letter he finally wrote was shorter than Robb's had been, but every word was carefully chosen. "My son, for you are always that. No matter what oaths I have sworn or what clothes I wear, The North looks to you now, as it once looked to me, and I have never been prouder of any man than I am of you in this moment. You ask why I chose exile over death, and the answer is both simple and complex. I chose life because the realm needs the Stark line to continue, and because there are threats coming that require living men to face them, not martyred ghosts. The wall stands between the 7 kingdoms, and dangers your Southron enemies cannot imagine. My service here is not exile. It is duty of a different kind. As for the choice you face, war is easy to start and hard to finish. The lords who call for battle see glory and revenge, but you must see further. Ask yourself not whether you can win, but whether the North will be stronger for the fighting. Ask not whether you can defeat the Lannisters, but whether the cost of victory is worth paying. Whatever you decide, know that you have my faith and my love. The old gods know that House Stark has given enough to the Game of Thrones. Perhaps it is time for us to serve higher purposes. Your father, Eddard of the Night's Watch, sealing the letter with black wax, for he had no right to the direwolf seal any more. Ned gave it to Maester Aemon's ravens, and prayed it would reach Robb before decisions became irreversible. 3 days later, another raven brought Catelyn's reply to his first letter. Her words were fire and ice, love and fury bound together in elegant script. Ned, I cannot call you husband now, for you have broken every vow we shared. You promised me you would return, and instead you chose disgrace. You swore to protect our children, and you left Sansa in the hands of our enemies, while you fled to the wall like some common criminal. I know why you confessed to treason. It was for our daughter, and for that I cannot hate you entirely. But why could you not have died with honor intact? Why could you not have given our children a father they could remember with pride instead of shame? Robb struggles with your shadow every day. The lords want war, but how can he lead them when his own father chose submission over defiance? How can he rally the North when the name Stark now carries the stain of your false confession? I will not pretend to understand your choice, Ned. I will not pretend to forgive it, but I will pray to the 7 that whatever path you walk at the wall, it serves some purpose greater than your own survival. Our children deserve that much from the father who abandoned them. Her words struck him like physical blows, each accusation a reminder of the prices his choices had exacted. That night, Ned walked the battlements of Castle Black until dawn, wrestling with guilt and doubt that no amount of cold wind could cleanse. Jon found him there as the sun rose, a pale disk behind banks of grey cloud. You can't carry all of it, Jon said without preamble. The guilt, the doubt, the weight of their expectations. It will break you if you try. Your mother has every right to her anger, Ned replied. I made a choice that saved one child and abandoned the others. What kind of father does that make me? A human one. Jon's voice was quiet but firm. Perfect fathers exist only in songs, and even they usually die heroic deaths that solve nothing. You're alive, which means you can still do good in the world. That has to count for something. Before Ned could respond, a commotion in the courtyard below caught their attention. A party of riders approached the gates of Castle Black, their banner snapping in the morning breeze. Even from a distance, the red and gold of House Lannister was unmistakable. 7 hells, Jon muttered. What's a Lannister doing here? As the gates opened to admit the riders, Ned recognized the small figure leading them. Tyrion Lannister, the imp, youngest son of Tywin Lannister, and brother to Queen Cersei. His presence at the wall could hardly be coincidence, not when the realm teetered on the edge of war. Lord Commander Mormont emerged from his quarters to greet the unexpected guest, and Ned watched from the battlements as formal courtesies were exchanged. Whatever brought Tyrion Lannister to Castle Black, it would complicate matters for everyone, but especially for a certain former hand of the king who wore black wool instead of chains. "This should be interesting," Jon observed dryly. An hour later, Ned found himself summoned to the Lord Commander's solar, where Tyrion Lannister sat comfortably by the fire, a cup of wine in his small hands. The dwarf looked up as Ned entered, his mismatched eyes registering surprise, and something that might have been amusement. "Well, well," Tyrion said, his voice carrying its familiar mixture of wit and cynicism. "Lord Eddard Stark, as I live and breathe. Though I suppose it's Brother Eddard now, isn't it? How the mighty have fallen, or perhaps risen, depending on one's perspective." "Lord Tyrion," Ned replied carefully, "an unexpected pleasure." "Oh, I doubt it's much of a pleasure," Tyrion chuckled, taking a sip of wine. "My presence here complicates your comfortable exile, doesn't it? Reminds you of all the unpleasant realities you left behind in King's Landing." Lord Commander Mormont watched this exchange with obvious interest, his weathered hands folded on his desk. "Lord Tyrion has come to see the wall," he said. "A scholarly interest, he claims." "Indeed," Tyrion nodded. "I've always wondered about this great barrier, this wonder of the ancient world. And now I find it defended by some very interesting men, including a certain former hand of the king who chose the black over the block." Ned felt the familiar weight of shame settling on his shoulders, but Jon's words echoed in his mind. "You can't carry all of it." "We all make choices, my lord," he said simply. "Some lead to crowns, others to walls of ice." "True enough," Tyrion agreed, studying Ned with those keen eyes. "Though some choices have consequences that ripple far beyond our intentions. Your son Robb, for instance. He faces a decision that could reshape the Seven Kingdoms. War or peace, independence or submission. Heavy choices for a young man." "You seem well informed about northern affairs," Ned observed. "Information is my vice," Tyrion admitted, "along with wine, books, and the occasional whore. But information is the most useful of my addictions." He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Your son gathers the north, Stark. The lords want war, want revenge for what they see as your humiliation. But war is a costly business, and the Lannisters are not easily defeated." "Is that a threat, Lord Tyrion?" Mormont asked quietly. "An observation," Tyrion replied. "Nothing more. Though I will say this, a wise king once told me that a good ruler must know when to fight and when to yield. Perhaps that wisdom could find its way north, carried by ravens or other means." The implication was clear. Tyrion was offering to carry messages, to serve as an intermediary between the wall and the wider world. It was a dangerous game, but one that might prevent the wholesale slaughter that war would bring. "I'll consider your words, Lord Tyrion," Ned said carefully. "I'm sure you will." Tyrion smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "In the meantime, perhaps you could show me this famous wall of yours. I'm told the view from the top is quite spectacular." As they prepared to escort Tyrion to the wall's summit, Ned caught Jon watching him with a thoughtful expression. His bastard son had observed the entire exchange, learning lessons in diplomacy and statecraft that no maester could have taught. Whatever came next, whatever choices Robb made in the north, Jon was gaining experience that might serve the realm well in the dark days ahead. The Game of Thrones continued, even here at the edge of the world. But perhaps, with careful maneuvering and wise counsel, the worst consequences could be avoided. The wall had stood for thousands of years, outlasting kings and kingdoms alike. Now it would test whether House Stark could survive the storms that were coming, united by bonds of blood and honor that distance could not break. Later that evening, as ravens carried messages south and the wall stood silent under a canopy of stars, Ned Stark allowed himself a moment of hope. He had chosen exile over death, disgrace over martyrdom. But if that choice could spare the North from needless war, if it could keep his family together despite the miles between them, then perhaps the price had been worth paying after all. Chapter 4. Brothers in Black. The morning sun cast long shadows across Castle Black's training yard as Ned adjusted his grip on the practice sword. The weapon felt strange in his hands after weeks of wielding quills and carrying supply sacks, but the familiar weight of steel was beginning to feel right again. Across from him, Jon moved with the fluid grace he had always possessed. But there was something different now, a wariness, as if he were testing himself against a new opponent rather than sparring with the man who had taught him to hold a blade. "Your footwork is getting sloppy," Ned observed, parrying Jon's overhead strike and countering with a thrust that stopped just short of his son's chest. "You're thinking too much about what I might do instead of focusing on what you should do." Jon stepped back, lowering his sword with a rueful smile. "It's strange, fighting you as an equal. Part of me still expects you to pull your strikes, to go easy because I'm your—" He caught himself, glancing around the yard where other brothers practiced their morning drills. "Because you're my what?" Ned asked quietly. "Here, we're both just brothers of the Night's Watch. Nothing more, nothing less." The words hung between them for a moment, heavy with the weight of their changed relationship. Around them, the sounds of combat continued, the clash of steel on steel, the thud of arrows finding their targets, the shouted instructions of Sir Alistair Thorne as he drilled the newer recruits with his customary cruelty. "Again," Ned said, raising his sword. "But this time stop thinking like a son and start fighting like a ranger." Their bout resumed, and this time Jon's movements carried the confidence that had made him one of Castle Black's most promising young brothers. He pressed the attack with controlled aggression, forcing Ned to give ground and respond with the hard-earned skill of a man who had fought in Robert's Rebellion and countless skirmishes since. "Better," Ned acknowledged, as Jon's blade found its way past his guard to rest against his ribs. "Much better." "You let me win," Jon accused, though there was no heat in his words. "Did I?" Ned sheathed his practice sword and picked up a water skin. "Or have you simply grown into the fighter I always knew you could be?" Before Jon could respond, a commotion near the armory drew their attention. Samwell Tarly stood surrounded by 3 older brothers, his face flushed with embarrassment and exertion. The fat boy, for despite months at the wall, Sam remained soft where the others had grown hard, clutched a sword in trembling hands while his tormentors circled like wolves around a wounded deer. "Come on, Tarly," one of them jeered. "Surely the Lord of Horn Hill's son can do better than that. Even the girls in the brothels fight harder." Sam's face went from red to white, and Ned saw the familiar look of a young man pushed beyond his limits. He had seen it before, in other soft boys forced into warriors' roles they were never meant to fill. Without conscious thought, he found himself walking toward the group. "Enough!" Ned's voice carried the quiet authority he had once used to command the North. The boys had sufficient practice for one morning. The 3 brothers turned, and Ned recognized the leader. Rast, a rapist who had taken the black rather than face gelding. The man's eyes narrowed as he took in Ned's approach, clearly weighing whether to challenge a former lord's authority. "And who made you our trainer, Stark?" Rast sneered. "Last I heard, you were just another recruit who chose the wall over the headsman's block." "I am," Ned replied evenly. "But I'm also a brother who's seen enough cruelty for one lifetime. Find another target for your amusement, or find it elsewhere entirely." For a moment, the tension in the yard was palpable. Other brothers had stopped their own training to watch the confrontation, and Ned could feel their eyes weighing his words against Rast's challenge. Then Jon stepped up beside his father, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "Problem here?" Jon asked, his tone deceptively mild. Rast looked between the two Starks, one fallen from grace, the other bastard-born, but both carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of men who would not be easily cowed. After a long moment, he spat in the dirt and stalked away, his companions following. Sam sagged with relief, nearly dropping his sword. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "You would have figured something out?" Ned interrupted gently. "Men like that prey on fear, Sam. Show them you're not afraid, and they'll find easier prey elsewhere." "But I am afraid," Sam admitted, his voice barely audible. "I'm terrified every moment I'm here. I wasn't meant for this life." Ned studied the young man before him, soft where he should be hard, gentle where the Night's Watch demanded ruthlessness, intelligent where most brothers preferred simple brutality. In the southern kingdoms, Samwell Tarly would have been a liability. Here at the Wall, properly guided, he might become something valuable indeed. "Tell me, Sam," Ned said thoughtfully, "what do you know about the archives in the library tower?" Sam's face lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm Ned had seen from him. "Everything, I think. I've read most of the books, catalogued the scrolls, even organized the older manuscripts by—" He caught himself, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, I get carried away when it comes to books." "Don't apologize for your strengths," Ned counseled. "The Night's Watch needs fighters, yes, but it also needs thinkers. Men who can read the old texts, understand the threats we face, plan for what's coming. That's not a lesser calling. It's a different one." From that day forward, Ned made a point of working with Sam during training sessions, not to turn him into a warrior, that would have been impossible, but to help him find his place among the brothers. He set Sam to researching the Watch's history, cataloguing reports from ranging missions, mapping the patterns of wildling movements beyond the Wall, work that played to the boys' strengths while contributing to their collective security. The changes were subtle at first, but they were noticed. Brothers began bringing Ned their problems, complaints about duty rosters, concerns about equipment maintenance, questions about tactics and strategy. His cell, sparse though it was, became an informal meeting place where men gathered to discuss the challenges they faced. "You realize what you're doing, don't you?" Jon asked him one evening as they walked the battlements together. Below them, the lights of Castle Black flickered against the darkness, while beyond the Wall, the haunted forest stretched into impenetrable blackness. "Enlighten me," Ned replied, though he suspected he knew what his son meant. "You're leading them," Jon said simply. "Not officially, not with any rank or title, but they're looking to you for guidance. They respect you." Ned considered this. "I'm doing what needs to be done. Nothing more." "The same thing you did in the North," Jon pressed. "The same thing that made men follow you without question. You see what needs fixing and you fix it, quietly, without fanfare or credit." They paused at a crenellation in the Wall, looking out over the vast expanse of wilderness beyond. Somewhere out there, Benjen Stark led a ranging party through lands that grew more dangerous with each passing day. Somewhere further south, Robb Stark prepared for a war that might tear the Seven Kingdoms apart. Here, caught between those two responsibilities, Ned tried to find meaning in his exile. Lord Commander Mormont has been watching you, John continued. I've seen him observing when you drill the men, when you organize the supply runs, when you settle disputes in the common hall. He sees what I see. And what's that? A leader. A man the brothers trust instinctively, not because of his birth or his titles, but because of who he is. John's voice carried a mixture of pride and concern. He's grooming you for something, Father. I'm not sure what, but something significant. Before Ned could respond, a horn echoed across the wall, one long blast that signaled the return of rangers. They hurried to the courtyard, joining the crowd of brothers gathering to meet whatever news the patrol brought. The ranging party that emerged from the tunnel was smaller than the one that had departed 3 days earlier. 7 men had left Castle Black. Only 4 returned, and they bore grim faces and bloodied weapons. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Jarman Buckwell, dismounted from his horse with obvious exhaustion. "Report!" Lord Commander Mormont's voice cut through the murmur of the assembled brothers. "Wildling raiders, Lord Commander," Buckwell said, his voice hoarse. 24 of them, maybe more. They hit a small settlement near the Shadow Tower, burned it to the ground. We tracked them for 2 days before we caught up. And, Mormont prompted, they fought like mad dogs, Buckwell continued. Desperate, vicious, like they were running from something worse than us. We killed most of them, but lost 3 good men in the process. He paused, his weathered face troubled. There's something else, Lord Commander. The survivors, before they died, they kept talking about the cold ones coming, about the dead walking. Raving mostly, but... But? Mormont's voice was sharp now, interested. One of them wasn't raving, sir. A woman, maybe 40 years old, not addled by fear or pain. She grabbed my arm before she died and said, "The long night comes again, Crow. Your wall of ice won't stop what's coming. Nothing will stop what's coming." A chill ran through the assembled brothers that had nothing to do with the northern wind. Ned felt it too, a sense of foreboding that touched something deep in his memory. Old Nan's stories, whispered in the godswood of Winterfell when he was young. Tales of others and wights, of a winter that lasted a generation, and heroes who fought with swords of fire. Wildling superstition, Sir Alistair Thorne declared dismissively. They've always had their tales of monsters and magic. Perhaps, Mormont replied, but his eyes were thoughtful. Double the watch tonight, and I want patrols increased along our entire section of the wall. His gaze found Ned in the crowd. "Brother Eddard, a word." They withdrew to the Lord Commander's solar, where Mormont poured wine for both of them, despite the early hour. "What do you make of Buckwell's report?" the old bear asked without preamble. Ned chose his words carefully. "In the north, we learn to listen when the small folk speak of things beyond the natural world. They may not understand what they've seen, but they've usually seen something. My thoughts exactly." Mormont moved to his wall of maps, pointing to the area where the attack had occurred. 3 similar incidents in the past month, all along the same general line. Whatever's driving the wildlings south, it's getting stronger. "You want to send out a larger ranging party," Ned guessed. "I want to send out the largest ranging party the Night's Watch has mounted in 50 years, Mormont corrected. 300 men, maybe more. A force strong enough to investigate these reports properly and return with answers." The implications were staggering. Such a ranging would strip Castle Black of most of its effective strength, leaving only the bare minimum needed to man the wall. It was a massive gamble based on little more than rumors and wildling testimony. "You'll need experienced commanders," Ned said slowly. "Men who understand tactics, logistics, leadership under pressure. Yes, Mormont agreed, his eyes never leaving Ned's face. I will. The meaning was clear, though neither man spoke it aloud. When the great ranging departed Castle Black, Ned Stark would be among its leaders. His skills as a military commander, dormant since his arrival at the Wall, would once again be called upon in service to the realm. That night, as Ned lay in his narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of his sleeping brothers, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had come to the Wall as a broken man, stripped of honor and purpose. But here, among outlaws and outcasts, he was finding both again. The Brotherhood of the Night's Watch was healing wounds he hadn't even realized needed healing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his resolve, and his growing sense of belonging among these black-clad guardians. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Winterfell, Eddard Stark felt truly at peace. He had found his place at the end of the world, and perhaps in doing so, he had found a way to serve the realm more truly than he ever had as a lord or a hand of the king. The Wall stood eternal above them, a barrier against the darkness beyond. And somewhere in that darkness, ancient evils stirred and began their slow march south. The Night's Watch would meet them when they came, and Ned Stark would stand with his brothers when that time arrived. Chapter 5. Shadows of War. The raven that arrived at dawn brought news that chilled Ned more than any northern wind. Lord Commander Mormont summoned him to his solar before the morning meal, his weathered face grim as he handed over the message. The parchment bore the seal of House Glover, vassals to Winterfell, and the words within painted a picture of devastation that made Ned's heart sink. "Riverrun is under siege," Ned read aloud, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Jaime Lannister leads 30,000 men against Lord Tully's forces. The Golden Tooth has fallen, and Lannister armies sweep through the Riverlands like a plague." He looked up at Mormont. "My wife. Catelyn is Tully-born. Her family, I know," Mormont said quietly. "There's more." Ned's eyes returned to the message, and the next lines hit him like physical blows. "King Robb has won victories at Oxcross and the Whispering Wood. He holds Jaime Lannister prisoner and marches south to lift the siege of Riverrun." The formal language couldn't hide the pride and terror warring in Ned's heart. His boy, for Robb would always be his boy, no matter how many battles he won, was leading men to war. Men would die because of choices Ned had made. "The supply convoy we expected from White Harbor has been diverted to feed Robb's army," Mormont continued, pointing to another message on his desk. "The one from King's Landing was delayed indefinitely, according to the Crown's Master of Coin. In other words, we're on our own." Ned set down the letter, his mind already calculating the implications. Castle Black housed nearly 800 men, counting the stewards, builders, and rangers. Their stores would last perhaps 2 months, if carefully rationed, less if they faced a harsh winter. What about the other castles along the Wall? Eastwatch still receives some supplies by sea, but most of their ships have been commandeered for the war effort. The Shadow Tower has always been largely self-sufficient, but they're no better off than we are. Mormont moved to his window, looking out over the practice yard where brothers went through their morning drills. The realm tears itself apart, while the real threats gather in the darkness beyond our wall. "Speaking of threats," Ned said carefully, "what news from the Rangers?" Mormont's expression darkened further. 3 more patrols have reported strange sightings. Dead animals found in perfect formation, as if arranged by an intelligent hand. Trees marked with symbols no wildling clan has ever used. And yesterday, Sir Otten Withers brought back this. The Lord Commander opened a wooden box on his desk, revealing what looked like a small sword made entirely of ice. The weapon was beautiful in its own way, perfectly formed but somehow wrong, as if the very air around it was colder than it should be. One of the wildlings they tracked was carrying it, Mormont explained. Dead when they found him, frozen solid despite the relatively mild weather. The blade hasn't melted, even in the warmth of this room. Ned studied the ice sword with growing unease. He had heard old Nan's stories, had listened to the ancient tales of others and their weapons of killing frost, but seeing physical evidence was different from hearing children's tales by the hearth in Winterfell. "How many of the men know about this?" he asked. "Few, and I intend to keep it that way for now. The brothers have enough to worry about without adding ancient terrors to their concerns." Mormont closed the box with a definitive snap. But it's becoming harder to dismiss the reports as wildling superstition. Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices from the common hall below. Through the window, they could see brothers gathering in agitated groups, their breakfast forgotten as arguments broke out across the room. "What in seven hells?" Mormont muttered, striding toward the door with Ned close behind. The common hall buzzed with tension when they entered. At the center of the commotion stood Sir Alistair Thorne, his sharp features twisted in disdain as he addressed a group of younger brothers. "Duty to the crown that still reigns in King's Landing," Thorne was saying, his voice cutting through the general murmur. "Not to some pretender king who calls himself Lord of Winterfell." "King Robb is the rightful king in the north," Jon Snow replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The North declared independence from a bastard king who murdered—" He caught himself before mentioning Ned directly, but the implication was clear. "Murdered a confessed traitor," Thorne shot back. "Or have you forgotten that your precious Lord Father admitted his treason before gods and men?" The hall fell silent at those words, and Ned felt every eye turn toward him. He had known this moment would come eventually, had dreaded it, since the first ravens brought news of war from the south. The Night's Watch was sworn to take no part in the conflicts of the Seven Kingdoms, but when those conflicts touched their own lives so directly, neutrality became a cruel joke. The Night's Watch takes no sides in the quarrels of the realm, Maester Aemon's voice carried from the high table, though the ancient man's words seemed fragile against the tension in the room. "We are sworn to serve the realm, not any king or queen who might claim it." "Easy words from a man who gave up his birthright before most of us were born," Thorne sneered. "But what of those whose families bleed in this war? What of brothers whose kin march under banners of rebellion? What of brothers whose kin sit in dungeons in King's Landing?" Another voice called out. Ned recognized the speaker as Darion, the former bard who had arrived with his own group of recruits. "My sister serves in the Red Keep. If King Joffrey decides she aided traitors—" "Enough!" Lord Commander Mormont's voice cut through the growing chaos like a blade. "All of you, enough. This is not a tavern where sellswords debate politics over wine. This is Castle Black, and you are sworn brothers of the Night's Watch." But the damage was done. The carefully maintained neutrality that kept the Night's Watch functioning had cracked, and through that crack seeped all the poison of the war consuming the Seven Kingdoms. Later that day, as evening shadows lengthened across the practice yard, Ned found Jon and Samwell Tarly in the library tower, surrounded by ancient texts and flickering candles. The two young men had grown close over the past weeks, their friendship bridging the gap between Jon's martial skills and Sam's scholarly pursuits. "Find anything useful?" Ned asked, settling into a chair beside them. The library was a refuge from the tensions below, a place where the weight of current events seemed less oppressive among the accumulated wisdom of ages. "Perhaps," Sam replied, looking up from a volume, bound in cracked leather. John asked me to research the old stories about the long night, to separate truth from legend if possible. And what have you discovered? John leaned forward, his expression serious. More than I expected. Sam's found references in multiple sources. Meister Childer's chronicles, fragments of the Annals of the Black Centaur, even some old Valyrian texts that discuss the enemy in the far north. The accounts vary in details, Sam added, his voice gaining confidence as he discussed his research. But certain elements appear consistently, the others, creatures of ice and shadow, the dead rising to serve them, a winter that lasted a generation and nearly destroyed all life in Westeros. Children's stories, Ned said, though his tone lacked conviction. The memory of that ice sword in Mormont's office was too fresh, too real. Maybe, John conceded. But the Night's Watch was founded for a reason, Father. The wall wasn't built to keep out human enemies. No tribe of wildlings could have justified such a massive undertaking. There had to be something else, something worse. Sam nodded eagerly. The texts all mention heroes who fought back. The last hero and his companions, Azor Ahai and his burning sword, Brandon the Builder who raised the wall. But they also speak of prices paid, sacrifices made. The long night ended, but at great cost. Ned studied his son's face in the candlelight, seeing the intelligence and determination that had always marked John as special. Here, surrounded by ancient knowledge and growing threats, John was coming into his own as more than just a skilled swordsman. He was becoming a leader, a thinker, a man capable of seeing the larger picture. Why do you think the Watch has forgotten so much of its original purpose? John asked. Why do we focus on wildlings and raiders instead of the other things? Because the other things were gone, Ned replied slowly. Or so everyone believed. It's easier to fight men than monsters, easier to explain duty in terms of human enemies, rather than supernatural threats. He paused, considering his words. But perhaps our enemies are returning, and the Watch must remember what it was truly founded to face. That night, Ned's dreams were plagued by visions of winter and war. He saw Robb leading men into battle, his young face set with determination that reminded Ned painfully of himself at the same age. He saw Catelyn weeping in Riverrun's great hall, praying to gods who seemed deaf to her pleas. He saw Sansa trapped in King's Landing, a beautiful bird in a cage of gold and steel. But strangest of all, he dreamed of Lyanna. His sister stood in the crypts beneath Winterfell, her stone likeness wreathed in shadows that seemed to move and breathe. In his dream, she spoke words he had never heard her say in life. Promise me, Ned. The song of ice and fire must be sung. The prince that was promised must fulfill his destiny. Promise me you'll tell him the truth when the time comes. He woke with a gasp, his heart pounding and sweat cooling on his skin despite the cold air of his cell. The dream felt more than ordinary sleep visions. It carried the weight of prophecy, of truths that demanded acknowledgement. Unable to return to sleep, Ned made his way to the wall's top, seeking the peace that came from standing beneath the vast canopy of northern stars. He was not surprised to find Maester Aemon there before him, the ancient man's blind eyes turned toward the heavens, as if he could still see the constellations he had learned in his youth. "Restless night, Brother Eddard?" Aemon asked, without turning. "Troubled dreams," Ned admitted, moving to stand beside the old Maester. "Dreams of the past and fears for the future." "Ah," Aemon nodded slowly. "I know those dreams well. They come more frequently as we age, as the weight of our secrets grows heavier." He was quiet for a moment, then added, Sometimes the burden becomes too great to bear alone. Ned felt the invitation in those words, the offer of understanding from a man who had lived longer and seen more than almost anyone in the Seven Kingdoms. Here, in the darkness before dawn, with the wall stretching endlessly in both directions, and the realm tearing itself apart below, perhaps it was time for truth. "There are some secrets," Ned said carefully, "that could destroy the very people we seek to protect, some truths that are more dangerous than the lies that hide them." "Indeed," Aemon agreed, "but there are also times when the truth becomes necessary, when the cost of continued deception outweighs the risks of revelation." He turned slightly toward Ned, his milky eyes somehow piercing in the starlight. "Tell me, brother, what do you know of the prince that was promised?" The question struck Ned like a physical blow. He had heard those words in his dream, spoken by Lyanna's shade. The coincidence was too great to ignore. "Old prophecies," he managed. "Melisandre of Ashai speaks of such things, I'm told. Prince Rhaegar believed—" He stopped, realizing he had said too much. "Yes," Aemon said softly. "Prince Rhaegar believed many things. He believed in prophecies, in destiny, in the power of dragon's blood to save the world." The old man's voice carried layers of meaning that Ned couldn't quite decipher. He also believed that some secrets are worth dying for, and that some truths are worth living for. They stood together in companionable silence as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon. Around them, Castle Black stirred to life as brothers began their daily routines. But here atop the wall, two men who had carried impossible burdens for most of their lives found a moment of peace in shared understanding. The war in the south continued, resources dwindled, and ancient enemies stirred in the far north. But for now, in the growing light of a new day, there was hope that truth might yet prevail over deception, that the right choices might still be made, despite the weight of past mistakes. The long night was coming, but it had not yet arrived. There was still time for preparation, for revelation, for the forging of alliances that might stand against the darkness, and perhaps when that time came, the truth about Jon Snow's parentage would prove to be not a burden to bear in silence, but a weapon to wield in defense of all they held dear. Chapter 6. The Ranging Beyond. The morning of the great ranging dawned cold and clear, with frost covering the ground like scattered diamonds. 300 men of the Night's Watch assembled in Castle Black's courtyard, the largest force to venture beyond the wall in 50 years. Ned stood among the senior rangers, his black cloak bearing no insignia of rank, yet carrying the weight of command that Lord Commander Mormont had quietly bestowed upon him. "Brothers," Mormont's voice carried across the assembled host, "today we ride into the unknown. For too long, we have been blind to what stirs beyond our wall. We go now to see with our own eyes, to learn what we can, and to return with answers that may save the realm." The old bear moved through the ranks, his weathered face set with determination. He paused before Ned, clasping his shoulder firmly. "You understand your role, Brother Eddard. First Ranger Benjen would have led the van, but with his continued absence, that honor falls to you." Ned nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like mail. Around him, 300 men prepared for a journey that might be their last. Some were veterans who had ranged beyond the wall dozens of times. Others were green boys who had never seen a wildling except in their nightmares. All looked to their leaders for confidence they weren't sure they possessed. "Father," Jon's voice was quiet, meant for Ned's ears alone. The young man had been assigned to Mormont's personal guard, a position of honor that kept him close to the command structure. "Are you certain about this? The reports we've been receiving? I'm certain that ignorance will kill us faster than knowledge," Ned replied, checking his weapons one final time. Ice, his ancestral Valyrian steel sword, hung at his side, a blade that had served House Stark for generations, and might soon face enemies his ancestors could never have imagined. "We need to know what we're facing, Jon. We need to know the truth." The gates of Castle Black groaned open, and the ranging party filed through in ordered columns. 300 horses carried 300 men into the haunted forest, their hoofbeats muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. Behind them, the wall rose like a white mountain against the sky, its ancient ice gleaming in the morning sun. The first day's travel was uneventful, following paths that rangers had used for years to patrol the immediate vicinity of the wall. But as they pushed deeper into the wilderness, the very air seemed to change. The trees grew larger and more twisted, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The silence was unnatural, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft jingle of mail. "It's too quiet," Jon observed, riding beside Ned at the head of the van. "Even in winter, there should be birds, small animals, something." Ned had noticed the same thing. In all his years in the north, he had never experienced such complete stillness in a forest. It felt like riding through a vast tomb, where even the wind feared to disturb the dead. On the third day, they encountered their first wildlings. The scouting party returned at midday with 5 prisoners bound and gagged, their wild eyes filled with terror that seemed to go beyond simple fear of capture. These were not the fierce raiders that usually troubled the Watcher's patrols. They were refugees, families fleeing south with whatever possessions they could carry. "They were moving fast when we found them," reported Sir Otten Wethers, the elderly ranger in charge of the scouting party. "Didn't even try to fight, just begged us not to kill them. Been running for days by the look of them." Ned studied the prisoners, noting their emaciated faces and desperate eyes. Among them was an old woman whose white hair had been cropped short, probably to make travel easier. She watched him with the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived many winters in the lands beyond the wall. "Remove her gag," Ned ordered. "I would speak with her." Lord Commander Mormont frowned, but nodded. The woman spat and worked her jaw, her pale eyes never leaving Ned's face. "You're the Crow Lord," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "The one who speaks for the ravens." "I serve the Night's Watch," Ned replied carefully. "Why do you flee south? What drives you toward the wall?" The woman's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You don't know. You stupid crows sit behind your ice wall and know nothing of what stirs in the real north." She leaned forward as far as her bonds allowed. "The dead walk, Crow Lord. The cold gods have awakened, and they bring winter that will never end." A murmur ran through the assembled rangers, but Ned held up a hand for silence. "Tell me what you've seen." "Seen?" The woman's eyes grew distant with remembered horror. "I've seen my own brother rise from his funeral pyre, with blue fire in his eyes. I've seen the White Walkers riding their dead horses across the frozen lakes, gathering an army that grows with every village they touch. I've seen the Night's King himself, tall as a pine tree and cold as the void between the stars." "The Night's King is a legend," Sir Alistair Thorne interjected dismissively, "a story to frighten children." The woman turned her fierce gaze on him. "Tell that to the Thenns, Crow. Tell that to the giants who kneel before him now. Tell that to the thousands who march in his host, their feet leaving no prints because they no longer draw breath." Ned felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern wind. He had heard enough wildling tales to know the difference between superstition and genuine terror. This woman spoke with the authority of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. "How far behind you is this army?" he asked. "Days, maybe weeks. They don't hurry like living men. They don't need to rest or eat or shelter from storms. They just come, slow and patient as winter itself." The interrogation continued for another hour, but the woman had little more to tell. Her band had fled from settlements near the Frostfangs, running day and night until they were captured by the Watch's scouts. The other prisoners confirmed her story in broad strokes, though their terror made coherent testimony difficult. That night, as the ranging party made camp in a grove of ancient weirwoods, the senior rangers gathered around Lord Commander Mormont's fire to debate their course. "We should turn back," Sir Alistair argued, his sharp features made harsher by the firelight. "If even half of what these wildlings claim is true, we're marching 300 men toward certain death." "And if we turn back now," Mormont countered, "we'll know nothing more than when we started. The Watch exists to guard against threats from beyond the wall. How can we guard against what we don't understand?" "The Lord Commander is right," Ned added quietly. "Ignorance won't protect us from what's coming. We need intelligence, numbers, capabilities, movement patterns. We need to know what we're truly facing." "Easy words from a man who chose exile over the headsman's block," Thorne sneered. "Perhaps Brother Eddard is eager to find a more honorable death in the wilderness." The insult hung in the air like smoke, drawing angry mutters from several rangers. John's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt, but Ned silenced him with a look. "My reasons for being here are my own," Ned said calmly. "But my duty to the Watch is absolute. We continue north." 2 days later, they reached Craster's Keep. The fortified homestead squatted in a clearing like a pustule on the forest's skin, its wooden walls and watchtowers speaking to its owner's paranoia. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and they could hear the sounds of activity within, the lowing of animals, the voices of women and children. "Craster's a friend to the Watch," Lord Commander Mormont explained as they approached the gates. "Such as he is. He provides information about wildling movements and sometimes shelter for ranging parties. But he's difficult. Let me handle the negotiations." The gates opened to reveal Craster himself, a heavy-set man with greying hair and the kind of cruel eyes that spoke to a lifetime of violence. He greeted Mormont with the elaborate courtesy of someone who understood the value of powerful allies, but his gaze lingered on Ned with obvious interest. "Well, well," Craster said, his voice carrying a mixture of amusement and calculation. "The great Lord Commander brings me a lordling in crow's feathers. Heard tell you had Eddard Stark himself taking the black. Didn't believe it until now." "Brother Eddard serves the Watch as we all do," Mormont replied carefully. "We seek shelter for the night, and any information you might have about movements to the north." Craster's laugh was harsh. "Information? Oh, I have information, old bear. Question is whether you'll like what I have to tell." He gestured for them to enter the keep. "Come, warm yourselves by my fire. We'll talk of many things, of wildlings and worse things, of the cold that comes creeping down from the true north." Inside the keep, Ned found himself in a hall that reeked of unwashed bodies and rotting food. Women moved about, serving crude ale and chunks of meat that might once have been livestock. They were all young, all bearing the unmistakable signs of Craster's blood. The same cruel eyes, the same weak chins. "Your wives?" Ned asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "My daughters," Craster replied with obvious relish at Ned's shocked expression. "My wives, my servants, my property. They serve me well, and I protect them from the wolves that prowl beyond these walls." Ned felt his stomach turn. He had seen cruelty before, had witnessed the worst that men could do to each other, but this casual admission of incest and abuse struck him like a physical blow. Around the hall, the women moved with the broken posture of those who had never known kindness. "You disapprove," Craster observed, studying Ned's face with amusement. "The High Lord finds my ways offensive. Tell me, Crow, what makes your southern customs better than my northern ones? At least my daughters know their place." "Because they're not customs," Ned replied quietly, his voice carrying the steel of his convictions. "They're crimes." The tension in the hall ratcheted higher, but before Craster could respond, one of the watch's sentries burst through the door, his face white with terror. "Lord Commander," he gasped, "you need to see this. All of you need to see this." They followed the sentry outside, where he led them to the edge of Craster's property. There, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, lay the bodies of a dozen animals, rabbits, foxes, even a small deer. But these weren't random kills left by predators. Each carcass had been precisely placed, their limbs arranged in ritualistic positions that spoke to an intelligence both alien and malevolent. "How long have these been here?" Mormont demanded. "They weren't here when we arrived," the sentry replied. "I checked this area myself not 2 hours ago. The ground was clear." John knelt beside the nearest body, studying the strange symbols carved into the earth around it. "Look at this," he said, pointing to marks that resembled no writing any of them had ever seen. "These weren't made by wildlings. The cuts are too precise, too deliberate." Ned examined the grisly display, his mind cataloguing details that his training as a lord and military commander told him were significant. The arrangement wasn't random. It conveyed meaning, though what that meaning might be remained unclear. "They know we're here," he said quietly. "Whatever made this display, they're watching us, studying us." "Aye," Craster agreed, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine unease. "The Cold Ones have been more active of late. They leave their signs, mark their territory. Sometimes they take—" He glanced toward his hall, where his daughter-wives waited in the shadows. "Take what?" Mormont's voice was sharp. Craster's cruel smile returned, but there was fear behind it now. "My sons. When they're born, the Cold Ones come for them. It's the price I pay for their protection, the bargain that keeps this place safe." The admission fell like a stone into still water, its implications rippling outward through the assembled rangers. Ned felt his hand move instinctively to his sword hilt, honor warring with pragmatism in his mind. Here was a man who traded his own children to monsters, who survived through collaboration with the very enemies the Night's Watch existed to fight. But here was also a man whose information might save 300 lives, whose cooperation might mean the difference between a successful ranging and a massacre in the wilderness. "You give them your sons," John said, his voice thick with disgust. "You give them to creatures of ice and shadow." "I give them what they want," Craster replied without shame, "and in return, they leave me and mine alone. It's a practical arrangement." Ned stared at this man who wore human shape, but seemed to have abandoned everything that made him human. The pragmatic part of his mind, the part that had served as hand of the king and made the hard choices that leadership required, understood the brutal logic of Craster's bargain. But his heart, his honor, his very soul recoiled from the horror of it. As night fell over Craster's keep, the ranging party posted extra guards and tried to find what rest they could. But sleep came hard to men who now knew they were being watched by inhuman eyes, studied by intelligences that viewed them not as enemies to be fought, but as resources to be harvested. Tomorrow they would continue north, deeper into lands where the very air seemed to whisper of ancient evils and forgotten terrors. They would seek answers to questions that might be better left unasked, pursue knowledge that might prove more dangerous than ignorance. But tonight, as Ned lay wakeful beneath a canopy of stars that seemed colder than they should, he found himself thinking not of the monsters that waited in the darkness ahead, but of the monster they had found wearing human form. The real horror was not that creatures like the others existed, but that men like Craster would willingly serve them. The great ranging would continue, but they had already learned their first terrible lesson about what lay beyond the wall. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who looked like friends. Chapter 7. The White Hunt. The attack came at dawn, when the mist hung thick between the ancient trees, and visibility was limited to mere yards in any direction. The ranging party had been moving through the haunted forest for 2 days since leaving Craster's Keep, following reports of wildling movements deeper into the wilderness. What they found instead was something far worse. Ned was riding with the vanguard when the first screams echoed through the fog. Not the cries of living men in pain, but something else. A sound that seemed to come from throats that no longer drew breath, voices that carried the chill of the grave. "Form ranks!" he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of command that came naturally after years of leading men in battle. But even as the rangers scrambled to obey, he knew this would be unlike any fight he had ever experienced. They came out of the mist like nightmares made flesh, dozens of them, perhaps more, their blue eyes burning with cold fire in the grey dawn light. These had once been men, women, even children, but death had transformed them into something monstrous. Their flesh was pale and mottled, their movements unnaturally swift and precise. They wielded weapons with the skill they had possessed in life, but now they felt no pain, no fear, no hesitation. Whites, the walking dead of legend, given terrible reality. "Iron and fire," Jon's voice cut through the chaos as he drew his sword. "They burn! They can be stopped!" Ned spurred his horse toward his son, ice singing as it cleared its sheath. The Valyrian steel blade seemed to gleam with inner light in the supernatural gloom, and when it met the first wight's rusted axe, there was a sound like breaking glass, and the creature simply ceased. But for every wight that fell to Valyrian steel, 3 more pressed forward. The ranging party found itself surrounded, outnumbered by enemies that should not exist, fighting a battle that belonged in the realm of legend rather than the harsh reality of military campaign. "Torches!" Lord Commander Mormont's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Set them ablaze!" The rangers who had managed to keep their wits began igniting whatever they could. Arrows, sword blades dipped in oil, even saddle blankets torn from their mounts. Fire proved effective where steel often failed, the wights shrieking as flames consumed their unnatural flesh. But the process was slow, dangerous, and costly in terms of time and resources they couldn't spare. Ned found himself fighting beside men he had trained with, eaten with, shared the long watches with during cold nights on the wall. But this was no training exercise in Castle Black's yard. Here, a single mistake meant death, or worse, joining the ranks of their enemies. "Behind you, father!" Jon's warning came just in time for Ned to pivot and take the head from a wight that had been creeping up on his flank. The creature had once been a woman, probably a wildling from one of the Free Folk clans. Now she was nothing but hunger and hatred animated by fell magic. "Stay close," Ned gasped, parrying another attack while looking for any sign of organization in the chaos around them. His tactical mind, honed by years of warfare against human enemies, struggled to adapt to this new reality. How did you outflank creatures that felt no fear? How did you break the morale of an army that was already dead? The answer came to him as he watched Ser Otten Withers go down beneath 3 wights, his screams cut short as cold fingers tore at his throat. These creatures might not feel fear, but they retained some shadow of the intelligence they had possessed in life. They coordinated their attacks, supported each other, even showed a crude tactical sense. "Rally to me!" Ned shouted, using the voice that had once commanded armies in Robert's rebellion. "Form a circle. Protect the torchbearers." Slowly, desperately, the surviving Rangers pulled back into a defensive formation. They had perhaps 200 men left, already a catastrophic loss that would cripple the Night's Watch for years to come. But if they could create a zone of fire and steal around the most vulnerable members of their party, they might yet escape this nightmare. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes. Time seemed to stretch and compress in the unnatural gloom, each moment an eternity of desperate struggle against enemies that should not exist. Ned's sword arm ached from the constant motion of parrying and striking, and his horse, trained for warfare but not for this, foamed at the mouth and rolled its eyes in terror. Then, through the press of battle, he saw it. Tall as a man, but impossibly thin, moving with fluid grace through the chaos of combat, came something that made even the whites seem natural by comparison. Its skin was pale as ice, its hair white as fresh snow, and its eyes burned with the blue fire of winter itself. It wore armor that seemed to be made from frozen water, and in its hands it carried a sword of ice that gleamed like captured moonlight. A White Walker. An other. The enemy that the Night's Watch had been founded to fight, reduced to legend, and dismissed as superstition until this moment. "There," Ned pointed with his sword, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "Their master! If we can reach—" The White Walker's gaze met his across the carnage, and Ned felt his blood freeze in his veins. Those alien eyes held intelligence, both vast and terrible, an awareness that spoke of eons spent in contemplation of humanity's destruction. When it smiled, showing teeth like icicles, the temperature around them seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The creature raised its ice sword and spoke a single word in a language that predated human civilization. The sound of it made Ned's bones ache and set his teeth on edge, but its meaning was clear enough. More whites rose from among the fallen, friends and enemies alike, joining the ranks of the undead. "We have to go," John said urgently, appearing at Ned's side with his sword bloody and his face grim. "We can't win this fight. Not here, not like this." Every instinct Ned possessed as a military commander rebelled against the idea of retreat. He had won battles against worse odds, had turned defeat into victory through courage and tactical brilliance. But this was different. This enemy could turn every casualty into another soldier for their cause, and the longer the battle continued, the weaker the living became, while the dead only grew stronger. "Sound the retreat," he ordered, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Fighting withdrawal. "Protect the wounded." The Rangers began to pull back, step by bloody step, while the whites pressed their advantage. They lost more good men in those few minutes than in the entire journey north, but they managed to create enough space to organize a proper retreat. Lord Commander Mormont was among the wounded, a deep gash across his ribs where a white's claws had found their mark. The old bear was still conscious, still giving orders, but his face was pale with blood loss and the shock of facing an enemy he had never truly believed existed. "Brother Eddard," Mormont gasped as they helped him onto a horse. "You must—" "The men look to you now. Get them home. Get word to the wall." The weight of command settled on Ned's shoulders like a familiar cloak. heavy with responsibility but not unwelcome. These men needed leadership, needed someone who could guide them through the nightmare landscape they now faced. He had failed at many things in his life, as a father, as a hand of the king, as a man of honor, but he would not fail them. "Mount up," he ordered. "We ride hard for the wall. No stops, no rest until we're behind our own gates." The retreat became a race against time and the creatures that pursued them. The White Walker had not followed them directly, but whites continued to dog their path, appearing out of the forest at irregular intervals to snap at their heels like wolves harrying a wounded deer. They lost more men during the retreat, some to white attacks, others to exhaustion, and wounds that proved too severe to survive the hard riding. By the time they saw the wall rising ahead of them like a beacon of hope, their force of 300 had been reduced to barely 200 survivors, many of them wounded, and all of them forever changed by what they had witnessed. The gates of Castle Black opened to receive them, and Ned felt a surge of relief, so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. But even as he helped carry the wounded to the Maester's chambers, he knew their troubles were far from over. They had learned the truth about what lay beyond the wall, and that truth was more terrible than any of them had imagined. That night, as Maester Aemon tended to Lord Commander Mormont's wounds, Ned found himself in the Lord Commander's solar, writing the most important report of his life. Every word had to be chosen carefully, every detail recorded with precision, because this document might be the only warning the Seven Kingdoms would receive before the long night fell again. Jon found him there in the small hours before dawn, his young face haggard with exhaustion and the weight of terrible knowledge. "How many did we lose?" Jon asked quietly, settling into a chair beside Ned's desk. "Too many," Ned replied, setting down his quill and rubbing his tired eyes. "Good men who trusted us to lead them safely. Men who died fighting an enemy we barely understand." "But we learned something," Jon said. "We know they're real now. We know they can be killed, with fire and Valyrian steel if not with regular weapons. We know they command the dead, but they're not invincible." Ned looked at his son. No, his brother now, for they were both of the Night's Watch, and saw the same grim determination that had carried House Stark through 1,000 years of northern winters. "Yes," he agreed. "We learned the truth. Now we have to decide what to do with that knowledge." Outside, the wall stood as it had for millennia, a barrier between the lands of the living and the realm of the dead. But they had seen beyond that barrier now, had fought against the ancient enemy, and lived to tell the tale. The question was whether anyone would believe them when they spoke of the horrors that waited in the darkness beyond the wall. The long night was coming, and the Night's Watch would stand against it as they always had. But now they knew the true face of their enemy, and that knowledge would either save them or damn them all. The great ranging was over, but the real war was just beginning. Chapter 8. The Lord Commander's Trust. The great hall of Castle Black had never felt so heavy with the weight of leadership as it did on the morning Ned first sat in the Lord Commander's chair. Jeor Mormont lay in the Master's chambers, his wounds from the white attack slowly healing, but leaving him too weak to command. The surviving Rangers looked to Ned with a mixture of hope and desperation. 200 men who had witnessed horrors beyond imagination, and now needed someone to guide them through the aftermath. "Brothers," Ned began, his voice carrying across the assembled men, "we have seen the enemy that our order was founded to fight. We have looked into the face of ancient evil and lived to tell the tale. Now we must decide what to do with that knowledge." The murmur that ran through the hall was not the usual grumbling of men forced to endure morning briefings. This was the sound of hardened warriors grappling with experiences that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Some faces showed defiance, others fear, and a few bore the hollow look of men whose faith in natural order had been shattered. "The wall still stands," Ned continued, rising from his seat to pace before them. "Our duty remains unchanged, to guard the realms of men against the threats that come from beyond. But our understanding of that threat has evolved, and our methods must evolve with it." Sir Alistair Thorne, his sharp features twisted with skepticism, spoke from his place among the senior rangers. "Pretty words, Lord Commander. But how do we fight an enemy that turns our own dead against us? How do we defend a wall when every casualty becomes another soldier in their army?" The title hung in the air. Lord Commander. Ned had not claimed it, had made no formal assumption of authority, but the men had begun using it naturally. The weight of command had settled on his shoulders like a familiar cloak, heavy but not unwelcome. "We adapt," Ned replied simply. "We learn from what we've seen, and we change our tactics accordingly." He gestured to Samwell Tarley, who sat among the stewards with a thick tome open before him. "Brother Sam has been researching our archives, looking for accounts of previous encounters with the others. Tell them what you've found." Sam stood nervously, his soft features flushed with the attention of so many hard men focused on him. The old texts speak of several weaknesses in the others and their whites. Fire, as we've seen, is effective. Valyrian steel seems to destroy them completely. Dragonglass, obsidian, is mentioned repeatedly as a weapon that can kill White Walkers. "Dragonglass?" John repeated thoughtfully. "There's supposed to be a cache of it somewhere on Dragonstone, isn't there?" "If the old records are accurate," Sam nodded. "But more importantly, there are natural deposits beneath the wall itself. The builders incorporated it into the foundation, though I'm not sure they understood why at the time." Ned felt a spark of hope at this news. Dragonglass weapons could be crafted, distributed to the Rangers, used to even the odds against supernatural enemies. It was a start, at least, something concrete they could build upon. "Brother Sam will work with the smiths to begin fashioning dragonglass weapons," Ned decided. "Everyone will learn to fight with fire as well as steel. Our training regimens will be adjusted to account for enemies that feel no pain and know no fear." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a raven bearing the seal of King's Landing. Maester Aemon, despite his advanced age, had insisted on attending the meeting, and he read the message aloud with growing concern. "His Grace King Joffrey commands the Night's Watch to send 200 men south to aid in suppressing the rebellion of the pretender Robb Stark. The Crown requires immediate compliance with this royal decree." The silence that followed was deafening. Every man in the hall understood the implications. Half their remaining strength demanded for a war that had nothing to do with their sworn duty, a conflict that would leave the wall dangerously undermanned just when they had learned how desperately it was needed. 200 men, Sir Alistair said slowly. "After losing 100 to the Whites, they want us to send 200 south." "The Night's Watch takes no part in the wars of the Seven Kingdoms," Ned replied, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. How could they claim neutrality when his own son led one of the armies in that war? How could he ignore the Crown's commands when doing so might bring royal wrath down on an already weakened watch? "Tell that to King Joffrey when his armies march north to punish our disobedience," Thorne sneered. "Tell that to the men who'll die when the Crown decides we're rebels to be crushed." Ned studied the message, his mind working through the political implications. Joffrey was young, cruel, and surrounded by advisers who saw the Night's Watch as just another resource to be exploited. They had no understanding of the true threats gathering beyond the wall, no appreciation for the ancient duty that kept the realm safe from horrors they couldn't imagine. "We will send ravens to all the great houses," he decided finally. Not as a plea for aid, but as a warning. The lords of the 7 kingdoms need to know what stirs in the far north, what army gathers in the lands of always winter. "And what of the king's command?" Thorne pressed. Ned met his gaze steadily. "The Night's Watch serves the realm, not any particular king who happens to sit the Iron Throne. Our duty is here, on the wall, facing the true enemy. Anyone who would strip us of half our strength while ancient evils march south is either a fool or a madman." The decision was made, though Ned knew it would have consequences. Defying a royal command was treason in the eyes of the law, but obeying it would be treason against their fundamental duty. Sometimes a man had to choose between conflicting loyalties and hope he chose the right one. That afternoon, Ned walked the wall with Jon, both of them lost in thought as they surveyed the vast wilderness beyond. The ice barrier stretched endlessly in both directions, a monument to human determination and ancient wisdom, but it suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable, insufficient for the task ahead. "The men are frightened," Jon observed, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Not of dying. They've made their peace with that. But of becoming something else, of being turned against their brothers after death." "Fear can be useful," Ned replied, "if it makes them more careful, more prepared. But it becomes dangerous if it paralyzes them or drives them to despair." They paused at the crenellation, where Ned had first spoken with Maester Aemon about secrets and burdens. The conversation felt like it had happened years ago, though only weeks had passed. Time moved differently here at the wall, measured not in days or seasons, but in crises survived and duties performed. "You're thinking about the king's command," Jon said. It wasn't a question, among other things. Ned leaned against the stone wall, feeling its ancient solidity beneath his hands. "Tell me, Jon, if you were in my position, what would you do?" Jon was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd ask myself what serves the realm best in the long term, not what appeases a boy king in the short term. The wall has stood for thousands of years. It will outlast Joffrey Baratheon, just as it outlasted Aegon the Conqueror and every other king who thought the Night's Watch existed for their convenience." "Wise words," Ned agreed. "But wisdom and politics don't always align. Defying the crown has consequences, and those consequences fall on more than just the man who makes the decision." "Then we face those consequences together," Jon replied firmly. "That's what brotherhood means, isn't it? Standing with each other even when the choices are all bad ones." That evening, Ned sat in the Lord Commander's solar, drafting the most important letters of his life. Ravens would fly to Winterfell, to King's Landing, to every great house that might listen. The truth about the others would be told, whether the lords of the 7 kingdoms believed it or not. His hand paused over the parchment as he considered how to word the warning to Robb. How could he explain to his son that the realm faced a threat that made their current war seem like a children's game? How could he make him understand that political victories meant nothing if humanity itself was at stake? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, setting down his quill. Jon stepped into the solar, carrying 2 cups of heated wine. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing one to Ned. "It's going to be a long night." They sat together in companionable silence for a while, father and son united by shared burdens and common purpose. Outside, The wall stood sentinel against the darkness, its ancient ice gleaming with reflected starlight. "Do you ever regret it?" Jon asked suddenly. "Taking the black? Giving up your lordship, your family, your old life?" Ned considered the question, swirling the wine in his cup as he thought. "I regret the circumstances that brought me here," he said finally. "I regret the pain my choices caused your mother and your siblings. But regret the choice itself?" He shook his head. "No. Here, at least, I know what I'm fighting for. Here, the enemy is clear and the duty is absolute. Even if that duty requires defying kings and risking everything. Especially then." Ned met his son's gaze directly. "When I was Hand of the King, I made compromises, told lies, played games I didn't understand. I thought I was serving the realm, but I was really serving men's ambitions and petty grievances. Here, there are no compromises. The wall stands or it falls. The realm lives or it dies. The choice is that simple." Jon nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current of recognition. "The men look to you now, not just as their commander, but as their guide through all this madness. They trust you to make the hard choices, to lead them through the darkness ahead." "And what about you?" Ned asked quietly. "Do you trust me to make the right choices?" "I trust you to make the choices that honor your oaths and protect the realm," Jon replied, "even if those choices cost us everything else." The next morning brought news that would test that trust. A raven from Winterfell carried word that Robb had won another victory, this time at the Crag, and had secured the allegiance of several Riverlands houses. But the same raven brought darker tidings. Catelyn had been taken prisoner by her own son after freeing Jaime Lannister in a desperate bid to save her daughters. Ned closed his eyes, feeling the weight of family ties pulling at his heart, despite his black cloak and sworn oaths. His wife imprisoned, his daughters still captive in King's Landing, his eldest son fighting a war that seemed to grow more complex and dangerous with each passing day. But his duty was here, on the wall, facing the ancient enemy that threatened to consume everything his family was fighting to preserve. He could not save them all, could not be in two places at once, could not serve both his blood and his brotherhood with equal dedication. So he chose the greater duty, the older obligation, the service that protected not just his family, but every family in the Seven Kingdoms. He chose the wall, the watch, and the war against the others that was coming, whether the realm was ready or not. The Lord Commander's chair had never felt more lonely than it did that morning, but Ned Stark wore its authority like armor against the doubts that whispered in his heart. Command was burden as much as privilege, but someone had to bear it. The long night was coming, and the Night's Watch would be ready. Chapter 9. Secrets Revealed. The Solar had become Ned's sanctuary in the week since taking command of Castle Black. Tonight it felt more like a confessional, heavy with the weight of truths too long buried and secrets that had shaped two lives without either man fully understanding their burden. Jon sat across from him, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied the maps scattered across the table. They had been planning patrol routes, discussing supply allocations, debating the placement of dragon-glass weapons along the wall's defenses. Normal command decisions that felt increasingly hollow as the truth Ned had carried for 18 years pressed against his ribs like a physical weight. "The men are ready," Jon said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence he had developed since taking on greater responsibilities within the Watch. "As ready as anyone can be for what's coming." "But father," he caught himself, glancing around the empty room as if someone might overhear the familiar address. "I mean, Lord Commander, there's something different in the air tonight. The ravens are restless. The wind carries sounds that don't belong to any natural storm." Ned nodded, having felt the same unease settling over Castle Black like a shroud. For 3 days, strange lights had been visible beyond the wall, not the familiar green dance of the aurora, but something colder, more purposeful. The wildling prisoners they still held spoke in whispers of the dead walking in impossible numbers, of ice spreading across the land like a plague. "John," Ned said quietly, setting aside the logistics reports that no longer seemed to matter. "Sit with me. There are things I must tell you before what's coming reaches our gates." Something in his tone made John look up sharply, the easy familiarity between them replaced by sudden tension. "What kind of things?" Ned stood and moved to the window, looking out at the wall that rose like a white mountain against the star-filled sky. How many times had he imagined this moment? How many different ways had he rehearsed these words in the privacy of his thoughts? None of his imagined scenarios had prepared him for the reality of it, the knowledge that everything John believed about himself was about to be shattered and rebuilt. "Your mother," Ned began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never told you about your mother." "You said she died in childbirth," John replied, confusion evident in his voice. "You said her name was Willa, a serving woman from Dawn." I lied. The words fell between them like stones dropping into still water, their ripples spreading outward to touch every assumption, every certainty John had ever held about his origins. "I have been lying to you for 18 years, and that lie has been the heaviest burden I have ever carried." John went very still, his face pale in the firelight. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the world is ending," Ned said simply, turning back to face his son. No, his nephew, though John didn't know that yet. "Because in the days ahead, you may need to know who you truly are in order to become who you need to be." He moved to his desk and withdrew an object he had kept hidden since his arrival at Castle Black, a small silver harp, tarnished with age, but still beautiful in its craftsmanship. John's eyes widened as he recognized it from descriptions in 100 songs and stories. "Prince Rhaegar's harp," John breathed. "How do you—" "Because I took it from his hands after I killed him at the Trident," Ned replied, "though she made me promise to protect you, to keep you safe from those who would see Rhaegar's son as either a threat to be eliminated or a tool to be exploited." "Lyanna Stark." John's voice was barely a whisper. "Rhaegar Targaryen." He looked up at Ned with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the space of moments. "That makes me a true-born prince," Ned finished. "If Rhaegar married your mother before her death, as I believe he did, then you are the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. If not, you are still the son of a prince and a great lord's daughter, with a claim that many would consider stronger than Joffrey Baratheon's." John stood abruptly, pacing to the far side of the room, as if physical distance could help him process what he had just learned. "All these years," he said, his voice thick with emotions Ned couldn't begin to untangle. "All these years I thought I was a bastard, a stain on your honor, a reminder of some moment of weakness, and you let me believe it." "To protect you," Ned said urgently. "If Robert had known, if anyone had known, you would have died before your second name day. Rhaegar's children were seen as threats to Robert's crown, enemies to be eliminated. I couldn't let that happen to Lyanna's son." "Lyanna's son," John repeated, as if testing how the words sounded. "Not yours. Never yours." He turned to face Ned, and the pain in his eyes was like a physical blow. "You raised me, trained me, loved me as if I were your own. But I was never your son, was I? I was your burden, your secret, your sister's dying wish made flesh. You were never a burden, Ned said fiercely, stepping toward him. You were my nephew, my blood, as precious to me as any of my children. More precious, perhaps, because you came to me through such pain and sacrifice. But I'm not Ned Stark's bastard, Jon said, his voice gaining strength as he worked through the implications. I'm not Jon Snow. He paused, seeming to struggle with the enormity of it. What is my true name? Ned felt his heart break a little at the question. Your mother never told me. She died before she could speak it, clutching your hand and whispering only, "Promise me, Ned. Promise me you'll keep him safe." Jon sank into his chair, his head in his hands. 18 years of believing I was a bastard who dishonored your marriage. 18 years of cat's hatred, of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, of wondering what was wrong with me that my own father wouldn't acknowledge me properly. He looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. And all the while, I had more right to sit the Iron Throne than the boy who wears the crown now. Rights and crowns are cold comfort when you're dead, Ned replied grimly. I chose to keep you alive rather than see you crowned and buried. I would make the same choice again. Before Jon could respond, the sound of horns echoed across Castle Black, 3 long blasts that made both men freeze. Not the single blast that announced returning rangers, nor the 2 that signaled wildling attacks. 3 blasts meant others, White Walkers, the ancient enemy that had not been seen for thousands of years. They rushed to the window and looked north, where the horizon glowed with an unnatural blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The glow was moving, advancing toward the wall with deliberate, inexorable purpose. How many do you think? Jon asked, his voice steady, despite the revelation they had just shared. Ned squinted into the distance, his military mind automatically calculating based on the extent of the glow. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. He turned to Jon, seeing not the confused young man grappling with a shattered identity, but the ranger who had fought beside him against impossible odds. Are you ready for this? Jon straightened, and Ned saw something new in his posture, not just the confidence of a skilled fighter, but the bearing of someone who had finally learned who he truly was. The bastard Jon Snow was gone, replaced by someone still finding his footing, but no longer uncertain of his worth. I've been ready my whole life, Jon replied. I just didn't know what I was preparing for. He paused, glancing at the silver harp that still lay on Ned's desk. This changes everything, doesn't it? Not just for me, but for the realm. If people knew, it would start another war, Ned said grimly. But Jon, he used the name deliberately, a reminder that whatever revelations had been shared, some bonds remained unchanged. There are prophecies, ancient texts that speak of a prince who was promised, a song of ice and fire, a hero who will stand against the darkness. Master Aemon knows more than he's told me, I think. You think I'm some prophesied hero? Jon's laugh held no humor. An hour ago I was a bastard of the Night's Watch. Now you tell me I'm a prince with a destiny. What am I supposed to do with that? What you've always done, Ned replied simply. Your duty. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Stand against the darkness, whatever form it takes. He gestured toward the approaching glow. The realm doesn't need another king, Jon. It needs a defender. A pounding on the door interrupted them, and Samwell Tarly burst in without waiting for permission, his face flushed with excitement and terror. Lord Commander, he gasped. The scouts report an army beyond counting approaches from the north. The dead walk in numbers that stretch from horizon to horizon, and at their head rides... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "They say the Night King himself leads them, tall as a giant and crowned with ice." Ned and Jon exchanged a look that carried the weight of their shared revelations and the magnitude of what they now faced. The time for secrets was over. The time for prophecies and hidden identities had passed. Now there was only duty, brotherhood, and the wall that stood between the living and the dead. "Sound the alarm," Ned commanded. "Call every brother to the wall. Send ravens to every castle, every keep, every hold in the 7 kingdoms. Tell them the long night has come again, and this time we know what brings it." As Sam hurried away to carry out his orders, Ned turned back to Jon. "Whatever you choose to call yourself, whatever claim you might have to thrones or crowns, tonight you are a brother of the Night's Watch. That brotherhood may be all that stands between humanity and eternal winter." Jon nodded, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "Then we stand together, as we always have." "Together," Ned agreed, though he knew that before the next dawn broke, everything would change again. The dead were coming, led by creatures of legend and nightmare, but they would face them not as lord and bastard, not as uncle and nephew, but as brothers in black, sworn to guard the realms of men until their watch ended. Outside, the glow on the northern horizon grew brighter, and the air itself seemed to whisper with the voices of the dead. The final battle was beginning, and the truth of Jon's parentage would either save the realm or die with them in the darkness that was coming. The Night's Watch had kept their vigil for thousands of years. Now, in their darkest hour, they would discover if their sacrifice meant anything at all. Chapter 10. The Horn That Wakes the Sleepers. The 3 horn blasts that shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Castle Black were unlike any sound Ned had ever heard. Each blast seemed to carry the weight of prophecy fulfilled, of ancient warnings finally made manifest. He stood atop the wall with Jon beside him, both men watching as the northern horizon blazed with cold fire that advanced like a tide of winter itself. "How long do we have?" Jon asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what approached them. The revelation of his parentage seemed almost trivial now, swept away by the immediacy of the threat that marched toward their ancient barrier. "Hours, perhaps less," Ned replied, studying the extent of the unnatural aurora that heralded the army of the dead. "They move without need for rest or sustenance, and they've been marching for days." He turned from the spectacle to face his son. "Nephew," he corrected himself, though the distinction mattered little now. "Are you ready for this?" Jon's hand moved instinctively to Longclaw's hilt, the Valyrian steel blade that Lord Commander Mormont had gifted him. "I've been ready since I took my vows. We all have." He paused, his dark eyes reflecting the distant glow. "Though I never imagined it would be like this." The wall beneath their feet thrummed with activity, as every brother of the Night's Watch rushed to his assigned position. Dragonglass weapons had been distributed to every man, along with bundles of arrows tipped with obsidian points that Samwell Tarly had spent weeks crafting in the forges. Fire braziers blazed at regular intervals along the wall's length, ready to ignite arrows, swords, and anything else that might burn bright enough to stop the dead. "Lord Commander," the voice belonged to Edison Tollett, one of the rangers who had survived the Great Ranging. "The ravens are away to every great house from Winterfell to Oldtown. If any aid is coming, they'll know to send it here." Ned nodded grimly. The messages had been brief but urgent. "The wall stands or all fall. Ancient enemy returns. Send every man who can hold a sword." Whether the lords of the 7 kingdoms would believe such desperate words, whether they could spare men while their own war consumed the realm, remained to be seen. "What of the southern approach?" Ned asked. Brother Darian spotted riders from the haunted forest, Dolorous Ed reported. But they're flying a peace banner, and— He hesitated. They look to be wildlings, Lord Commander, women and children among them. The irony was not lost on Ned. For 1,000 years the Night's Watch had defended the wall against wildling raiders and invaders. Now, as the true enemy revealed itself, those same wildlings came seeking sanctuary behind the very barrier they had spent generations trying to breach. How many? John asked. Perhaps 200, maybe more. They're ragged, half-frozen, and they've been running hard from something that scared them worse than the crows ever did. Ned made his decision quickly. Open the gates, bring them inside, but keep them under guard until we know their intentions. You mean to let them through the wall? Sir Alistair Thorne's voice carried his usual skepticism, but there was something else now, a grudging acknowledgement that normal rules no longer applied. Our sworn duty is to defend the realms of men, Ned interrupted firmly. All men, from all threats. The enemy that comes for us makes no distinction between crow and wildling, Southron and Northman. We stand together or we fall separately. An hour later, Ned stood in Castle Black's great hall, facing a delegation of wildling leaders who would have been mortal enemies just days before. Their leader was a tall woman with fierce blue eyes and scars that spoke to a lifetime of violence, but her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. I am Ygritte of the Free Folk, she declared, her chin raised defiantly, despite her people's desperate circumstances. We come not as supplicants, but as warriors who would stand against the true enemy. You're welcome here, Ned replied, and saw surprise flicker across her weathered features. But I need to know what you've seen, what we're truly facing. The wildling woman's expression grew haunted. We've seen the dead march in numbers beyond Counting Crow. We've seen giants made of ice and shadow, mammoths with blue fire in their eyes. We've seen the Night King himself, tall as 2 men and crowned with winter's fury. She leaned forward. And we've seen what happens to those who fall before his host. They rise again, their eyes burning with cold light, and they turn on their own kin without mercy or recognition. How many fight under his banner? John asked from his position beside Ned. Every clan that ever lived north of your wall, Ygritte replied grimly. The Thenns, the Ice River clans, the cave people of the Frostfangs, all of them march now in his host. But not by choice. They march because death has claimed them, and death serves the Night King. The implications were staggering. Not hundreds or even thousands, but tens of thousands of whites, commanded by creatures of supernatural power and intelligence. Against this host, the Night's Watch's 200 surviving brothers seemed pitifully inadequate. We offer our strength to your wall, Ygritte continued. My people know how to fight, how to survive when survival seems impossible. We've spent our lives battling the cold and the dark. Now we face the cold that never ends, and the dark that devours light itself. Ned studied the wildling leader, seeing in her the same grim determination that had carried the Night's Watch through its darkest hours. Your people will fight alongside our brothers? We'll fight alongside any who stand against the Night King, she replied without hesitation. Our quarrels with the crows are dust compared to what comes from the north. When the dead walk, the living must stand together. That afternoon, the strangest sight in the Night's Watch's long history unfolded in Castle Black's training yards. Brothers in black wool trained alongside wildlings in rough furs, sharing knowledge of weapons and tactics that had been refined by generations of conflict. Old enemies became uneasy allies as they prepared to face a foe that threatened everything both sides had ever known. Ned moved among them, offering encouragement and tactical advice, but his thoughts were consumed by calculations that grew more desperate with each passing hour. Even with the wildling reinforcements, they had perhaps 400 fighters to defend a wall that stretched 300 miles. The enemy could attack at any point, overwhelm any section, and once they breached the barrier, nothing would stop them from sweeping south into the heart of the Seven Kingdoms. "Father," Jon's voice drew him from his dark contemplations. "The men are asking for you. They need to hear from their commander before the battle begins." Ned nodded, knowing that words could be as important as swords in the hours ahead. He made his way to the wall's summit, where every fighter, crow and wildling alike, had gathered in the torchlight. The northern horizon blazed with supernatural fire that had grown visibly closer since dawn, and the air itself seemed to whisper with the voices of the approaching dead. "Brothers," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled host, "and friends, for that is what you are now, whatever banners you once followed, whatever oaths you once swore. Tonight we stand together against an enemy that would end not just our lives, but life itself. I came to this wall as a broken man, stripped of honor and cast out from the world I knew. You welcomed me, taught me what it truly means to serve something greater than myself. You showed me that honor is not about the titles men give you or the castles you hold, but about standing firm when others would flee, about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The enemy that comes for us tonight is ancient beyond measure, powerful beyond comprehension. They command the dead, wield winter as a weapon, and know neither mercy nor fear. But they have never faced what stands before them now. The Night's Watch in its full fury, united with the free folk in common cause, defending not just a wall of ice, but the very idea that life should prevail over death. Some of you are knights who gave up titles and lands to serve. Some are thieves and killers who found redemption in black wool. Some are wildlings who chose to defend rather than destroy. But tonight, we are all the same thing, guardians of humanity's flame against the darkness that would extinguish it forever. The lords in their southern castles may not know our names or remember our sacrifice. History may forget us entirely, but the children who will live to see another spring, the lovers who will find joy in each other's arms, the farmers who will plant seeds in soil unmarked by frost, they will live because we stood here tonight and said no further. This wall has stood for 8,000 years. It has weathered the storms of ages, outlasted kingdoms and dynasties, endured while empires crumbled to dust. Tonight, it faces its ultimate test. And we, all of us, crow and wildling, highborn and low, we are its guardians. The night is dark and full of terrors, but we are darker still. We are the sword in the darkness, the watchers on the walls. We are the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, and when the sun rises tomorrow, it will shine on a world still free because we held the line when it mattered most. The roar that arose from the assembled defenders seemed to shake the very foundations of the wall. Swords rang against shields, wildlings howled their war cries, and for a moment the cold fire on the northern horizon seemed less bright, less certain of its victory. As the fighters dispersed to their final preparations, Jon lingered beside Ned on the wall's edge. "You think we can win?" Ned looked at his nephew, his son in all the ways that mattered, and saw not the confused bastard who had once struggled to find his place in the world, but a man who had found his purpose in the most unlikely of places. "I think we can do our duty," he replied simply. "Win or lose, live or die, we'll do what the Night's Watch has always done. We'll stand our watch until it ends." The glow on the horizon pulsed like a heartbeat, and the very air seemed to grow colder as the army of the dead drew near. But atop the wall, surrounded by brothers in black and allies who had once been enemies, Ned Stark felt something he had not experienced since leaving Winterfell, a sense of perfect clarity about his purpose and his place in the world. He had come to the wall in disgrace, carrying the weight of failure and the burden of secrets. Now, as the ancient enemy emerged from legend into terrible reality, he stood ready to face them not as a fallen lord seeking redemption, but as a brother of the Night's Watch, guardian of the realm, protector of all who lived and breathed and hoped in the world of men. The horn that wakes the sleepers had sounded, the long night had begun, and on the wall, the last defenders of humanity prepared to face the darkness with fire in their hearts and steel in their hands, united by bonds stronger than blood or birth in the knowledge that some things were worth dying for. The battle for the dawn was about to begin. Chapter 11. The Long Night's Battle. The assault began at midnight, when the darkness was deepest and the cold most bitter. It came not with the chaotic rush of human armies, but with the methodical precision of creatures that knew neither fear nor haste. The army of the dead advanced like a tide of winter itself, silent save for the cracking of ice beneath countless feet that no longer felt the ground they walked upon. Ned stood atop the wall beside the great crossbow that had been mounted there centuries ago, watching as the northern horizon filled with blue-eyed nightmares beyond counting. Whites marched in perfect formation, their ranks stretching from east to west as far as the eye could see. Among them strode giants made of ice and shadow, and mammoths whose tusks gleamed like frozen moonlight. At their head rode the White Walkers themselves, tall and terrible on horses that seemed carved from winter wind. "Archers!" Ned's voice cut through the still air, carrying the authority of command to every section of the wall. "Light your arrows! Fire at will!" The response was immediate. Hundreds of dragon-glass-tipped arrows, wrapped in oil-soaked cloth and set ablaze, arced through the darkness like falling stars. Where they struck whites, the creatures burst into flame and crumbled to ash. But for every one that fell, 10 more pressed forward, their blue eyes burning with cold fire that never wavered. "They're not slowing down," Jon observed, appearing at Ned's side with long claw already drawn. The Valyrian steel blade seemed to gleam with inner light in the supernatural darkness, and Ned noticed something different about his nephew's posture, a confidence, a sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. "They don't need to," Ned replied, loosing another flaming arrow into the advancing horde. "They have all night, and we have only what strength we can muster before dawn." The first giants reached the base of the wall and began to climb, their massive fingers finding purchase in the ancient ice as easily as a man might climb a ladder. The defenders focused their fire on these enormous threats, but dragon-glass arrows seemed pitiful against creatures the size of small towers. "Oil!" Ned commanded, and brothers rolled great barrels to the wall's edge. Black streams poured down the ice face, and when the flames followed, the giants screamed, a sound like glaciers cracking, like winter itself in agony. 2 fell, their massive forms creating craters in the frozen ground below. But others kept climbing, and behind them came whites with grappling hooks and crude ladders, seeking any way to breach the ancient barrier. The battle raged along the entire length of Castle Black's section of the wall. To the east, Sir Alliser Thorne commanded the defences, with his usual harsh efficiency, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of combat. To the west, Ygritte led her wildling warriors in a fighting retreat along the wall's narrow walkway, as whites somehow found footholds in the ice and scrambled over the edge. But it was in the center, where Ned fought alongside the men he had trained and led, that the battle's outcome would be decided. Here, the greatest concentration of White Walkers had gathered, their alien intelligence focused on the heart of the Night's Watch's defenses. "Look there," Jon said, pointing through the chaos of battle. "The tall one, with the crown of ice. That has to be the Night King himself." Ned followed his nephew's gaze and felt his blood freeze. The creature that approached the wall's base was indeed tall as two men, its skin pale as old bone, its eyes burning with blue fire that seemed to see through flesh and stone alike. In its hands it carried a great horn, carved from what looked like mammoth tusk, but gleaming with the same cold light that emanated from its eyes. "The Horn of Winter," Ned whispered, recognition dawning like a cold sunrise. If the legends are true, the Night King raised the horn to its lips, and the sound that emerged was like nothing Ned had ever heard. It was the voice of winter itself, the song of ice and ending, a note that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the earth. The wall trembled beneath their feet, ancient ice cracking and groaning as magic older than human memory was tested against magic older still. A section of the wall, perhaps 100 yards to the east of Castle Black, simply collapsed. Thousands of tons of ice and stone crashed down in a thunderous avalanche, creating a breach through which the army of the dead could pour like water through a broken dam. "The wall!" Samwell Tarly's voice cracked with terror as he watched the ancient barrier fail for the first time in 8,000 years. "They've broken the wall! Form ranks at the breach!" Ned commanded, his voice somehow carrying over the roar of collapsing ice. "Every man to the breach! If they get through, nothing south of here will survive." The defenders abandoned their positions along the wall's length and converged on the gap, knowing that this moment would determine the fate of every living soul in the Seven Kingdoms. Brothers of the Night's Watch fought alongside wildling warriors, their old enmities forgotten in the face of extinction itself. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the annals of warfare. Men fought creatures that had once been men, their dragon-glass weapons and flaming swords the only things standing between humanity and eternal winter. Every time a defender fell, he rose again within moments, his eyes burning with blue fire as he turned on his former comrades. Ned found himself separated from the main force, fighting in a pocket of desperate resistance near the breach's eastern edge. Around him, men he had trained and led gave their lives to hold ground that seemed impossible to defend. Dolorous Ed fell with a white's claws in his throat, only to rise again seconds later and attack the very men he had died defending. Sir Alistair Thorne took a dozen whites with him when he triggered a cache of wildfire, his final act one of defiance against the darkness. It was then that Ned saw him, a White Walker, striding through the chaos with fluid grace, its ice sword gleaming as it cut down anyone who dared stand in its path. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and Ned felt the creature's alien intelligence focus on him with something that might have been recognition or respect. The other approached slowly, almost ceremoniously, as if it understood that this would be a duel between champions rather than mere slaughter. Around them, the battle continued to rage. But for this moment they might have been alone in the world. Man and monster, ice and fire, life and death meeting at the point of a blade. Ned raised ice, his ancestral sword singing as it cleared its sheath. The Valyrian steel gleamed with inner fire, and the White Walker paused, perhaps recognizing the threat that such a blade represented. They circled each other warily, and then the other attacked with speed that seemed impossible for something so tall and seemingly fragile. Its ice blade met Ned's steel in a shower of sparks that burned cold and blue, and the shock of contact nearly numbed his sword arm. But Ned had not survived Robert's rebellion and countless smaller conflicts by being slow or unprepared. He had learned to fight from the finest masters in the Seven Kingdoms, had faced knights and killers and everything in between. This creature might be ancient and terrible, but it was still something that could be fought, something that could be killed. They dueled across the broken ground, ice meeting steel in a dance of death that seemed to last hours, but could only have been minutes. The White Walker was faster, stronger, but Ned was experienced, cunning, willing to use every dirty trick he had learned in a lifetime of warfare. When the other overextended itself on a thrust aimed at his heart, Ned sidestepped and brought ice around in a horizontal cut that took the creature's head from its shoulders. The White Walker's death scream was like breaking glass, like winter wind through empty halls, and every wight within 100 yards simply collapsed as whatever magic animated them was severed. But even as Ned stood victorious over his fallen enemy, he could see that the battle was far from over. The breach in the wall continued to widen as more giants attacked its weakened structure, and though the defenders fought with desperate courage, they were being slowly overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It was then that Jon Snow stepped into legend. Ned watched in amazement as his nephew walked calmly through the chaos of battle, his sword cutting down wights with almost casual efficiency. But it was not his swordsmanship that drew attention. It was the way the White Walkers seemed to recoil from his presence, the way their magic seemed to falter when he drew near. "Dragon's blood," Maester Aemon's voice whispered in Ned's memory. The old man had spoken of prophecies, of a prince that was promised, of fire made flesh to stand against the cold. Now, watching Jon fight with a power that seemed to emanate from his very being, Ned began to understand. Jon reached the Night King itself as it prepared to sound the horn of winter again. The ancient creature turned to face this new threat, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Ice and fire, death and life, the old magic and the new. When they fought, reality perhaps, but from the choices that brought salvation. The long night was ending, and with it, a new day was about to dawn. Chapter 12. The Dawn of Spring. 3 months after the Battle of the Wall, Castle Black bore scars that would never fully heal, but it also carried a dignity that had been absent for generations. The ancient fortress bustled with activity as brothers worked alongside stonemasons from the south to repair the breach in the wall, their black cloaks mingling with the colors of a dozen great houses who had stayed to help rebuild what had nearly been lost forever. Ned stood in the Lord Commander's solar, his solar now, after the brothers had elected him unanimously to lead the Night's Watch into whatever future awaited them. The weight of the position felt different from his old lordship of Winterfell. There, he had ruled by birth and tradition. Here, he led by choice and consent, his authority earned through sacrifice and proven in the crucible of humanity's darkest hour. "The casualty reports, Lord Commander," Samwell Tarly said quietly, setting a thick ledger on the desk. Sam had grown in confidence since the battle, his role as the Night's Watch's chronicler, giving him purpose that went far beyond his father's expectations. 137 brothers fell during the battle, but he paused, a small smile crossing his features. "We have 423 new recruits from the southern kingdoms, lords' sons, Knights, even some who served in the recent wars. They come. Catelyn Stark lives and has been freed from her imprisonment. Relief flooded through Ned at this news. His family had survived the chaos that had consumed the Seven Kingdoms, and perhaps now they could begin to heal from the wounds that politics and ambition had inflicted upon them. He had chosen the wall over the world, but the world, his world, endured. "And there's something else," Sam continued, his voice carrying barely contained excitement. "A royal party approaches Castle Black. King Tommen himself comes north to see the wall and to speak with you, Lord Commander." Before Ned could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. "Enter," he called, and Jon Snow stepped into the solar, his bearing now that of a man who had fully come into his own. The revelation of his parentage had changed him, not in his essential nature, but in his understanding of his place in the world's greater story. "The royal party has arrived," Jon announced. "King Tommen, his small council, and—" He paused, a complicated expression crossing his features. "Robb is with them, and Mother." Ned felt his heart leap and sink simultaneously. The prospect of seeing his family again filled him with joy, but also with uncertainty. What could he say to the wife he had left behind, to the son who had fought a war in his name while he served in exile? How could he explain choices that he still struggled to understand himself? An hour later, Ned stood in Castle Black's great hall as a procession of figures from his past and present filed through the ancient doors. King Tommen, barely 16, but bearing himself with the gravitas that kingship demanded, led the way. Behind him came faces Ned recognized from his time as Hand, Lord Tywin Lannister, Grand Maester Pycelle, others who had once seen him as traitor and criminal. But it was the figures at the rear of the procession who claimed his attention entirely. Robb entered first, tall and broad-shouldered, every inch the king he had become, but choosing to wear simple northern garb rather than a crown. Behind him walked Catelyn, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, but her blue eyes still fierce with the intelligence and strength that had first captured Ned's heart. "Your Grace," Ned said formally, offering a bow to the young king. "Castle Black welcomes you to the wall." "Lord Commander," Tommen replied, and Ned noticed the respect in the boy's voice, not the grudging acknowledgement of a political necessity, but genuine honor for what the Night's Watch had accomplished. "Rise. It is we who should bow to you. The realm owes you a debt that can never be repaid." "The Night's Watch serves the realm," Ned replied simply. "We ask for nothing more than the chance to continue that service." "And you shall have it," the king declared. "But first, there are other debts to acknowledge." He turned toward Robb and Catelyn, his meaning clear. For a moment, the great hall fell silent as father, son, and wife looked at each other across the gulf of time and pain that separated them. Then Robb stepped forward, and the formal distance collapsed as he embraced his father for the first time since Ned had left Winterfell. "I'm sorry," Robb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for doubting you, for not understanding. I know now why you made the choices you did." "You have nothing to apologize for," Ned replied, holding his son tight. "You became the king the North needed, the leader I always hoped you would be. Your mother, how Eddard Stark saved the realm by becoming something more than Eddard Stark ever could have been." Later that evening, after the formal ceremonies and political discussions had concluded, Ned walked the wall with his family. The barrier had been repaired, the breach sealed with new ice and ancient magic, but the scars remained, a reminder of how close humanity had come to extinction. "Jon told me," Robb said quietly, as they paused at a crenellation overlooking the haunted forest. About his parentage, about why you kept the secret for so long. Ned glanced at Jon, who walked slightly apart from the group, still processing the changes in his life. And I understand that too, Robb replied. Another choice that looked like betrayal but was actually the deepest kind of love. He paused. He's my brother, regardless of whose blood runs in his veins. That will never change. What will he do now? Catelyn asked, her voice carrying a concern that Ned hadn't expected. For 18 years she had resented Jon's presence in her home. Now, perhaps, she was beginning to see him as Ned always had, not as a threat or a reminder of betrayal, but as a young man deserving of love and guidance. That's his choice to make, Ned replied. He has a claim to the Iron Throne that many would consider stronger than Tommen's, but claims a cold comfort to men who value duty over ambition. As if summoned by their conversation, Jon approached the small group. "I've made my decision," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had found his purpose. "I'm staying with the Night's Watch. The realm may not face another long night for generations, but when it comes, they'll need men who remember what happened here. They'll need the Watch to be ready." "And your other claim?" Robb asked carefully. Jon smiled, the first truly peaceful expression Ned had seen on his face since learning the truth of his birth. "I am Jon Snow, brother of the Night's Watch, and son of Eddard Stark in all the ways that matter. That's enough for any man." King Tommen approached them then, having completed his own circuit of the wall. "Lord Commander," he said formally, "it is time." Ned knew what the king meant. They had discussed it earlier, a formal ceremony to restore House Stark's honor and acknowledge the role the Night's Watch had played in saving the realm. The assembly gathered in Castle Black's courtyard as torches were lit against the growing darkness. Representatives from every great house stood in witness as King Tommen, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, spoke words that would be remembered by history. "Let it be known throughout the Seven Kingdoms that Eddard Stark, formerly Lord of Winterfell, didn't die in disgrace, but lived in honor. His confession of treason was a lie spoken to protect the innocent, his exile to the Wall, a sacrifice that preserved the realm. The Night's Watch, under his leadership, has faced the ancient enemy and emerged victorious. The realm owes Lord Commander Eddard Stark a debt that time itself cannot diminish." The crowd's cheer echoed off the wall itself, but Ned felt no surge of vindication or triumph. The restoration of his honor was welcome, but it was not why he had fought, not why he had chosen this life. He had found something more valuable than reputation or legacy. He had found purpose. As the ceremony concluded and the various dignitaries began to disperse, Ned found himself alone with Jon atop the wall once more. The sun was beginning to rise in the east, painting the ancient ice with shades of rose and gold that made it seem almost alive. "Do you regret it?" Jon asked quietly. "Giving up everything you had for this?" Ned considered the question, as he had many times over the months since the battle. "I regret the pain my choices caused people I loved," he said finally. "But regret the choices themselves? No. This is where I was meant to be, Jon. This is what I was meant to do." They stood together in comfortable silence, father and son, uncle and nephew, two men who had found their place in a world that had never quite known what to do with them. Around them, Castle Black stirred to life as brothers began their daily duties, the eternal watch that had protected humanity for 8,000 years and would continue long after both of them were gone. "The realm is safe," Jon observed, watching the sun climb higher in the eastern sky. "For now," Ned agreed. But winter will come again, as it always does, and when it comes, the watch will be ready. Below them, ravens took flight from the castle's towers, carrying messages to every corner of the 7 kingdoms, messages that spoke of duty fulfilled, of honor restored, of an ancient brotherhood that had proved itself worthy of the trust placed in it by generations of the living. Eddard Stark had come to the wall as a broken man seeking exile from his failures. He had found instead a brotherhood that valued service over station, duty over glory, sacrifice over self. He had discovered that true honor was not about the titles men gave you or the songs they sang about your deeds, but about standing watch in the darkness so that others might sleep safely in the light. The sunrise painted the wall in gold and crimson, and Lord Commander Eddard Stark smiled as he began another day of the watch that would never end. He had found his place at the edge of the world, and in doing so, he had helped ensure that the world itself would endure. Winter might come again, but when it did, it would find the realm ready. The Night's Watch would stand guard, as they always had, as they always would. And in that eternal vigil, Ned Stark had found not disgrace, but the greatest honor of his life, the chance to serve something larger than himself, something worthy of any sacrifice. The long night was over, the dawn had come, and the watch continued,